In 1497, John Cabot navigated toward North America under an English flag. Behind him lay a small island kingdom, unremarkable among European powers. Within centuries, this nation would govern a quarter of the world's land and people through determination, opportunity, and often violence. This history evokes contrasting images: soldiers under unforgiving suns, ships laden with spices, independence announcements crackling over radios, and cricket played from Caribbean beaches to South Asian fields. For some, it represents achievement: railways, parliaments, and courts still functioning today. For others, it signifies displacement, exploitation, and cultural disruption. Both perspectives hold truth. This global dominance wasn't planned. Britain stumbled into power, driven largely by private enterprise. A trading company became the ruler of millions. Pirates became admirals. Small outposts grew into continent-spanning dominions. When it ended with ceremonial flag lowerings rather than dramatic collapse, it left behind nations speaking English and practicing parliamentary democracy while defining themselves in opposition to their former ruler. This story, spanning centuries and continents, reveals human capacity for both achievement and failure, creating infrastructure that still stands alongside scars that have yet to heal. The foundations of what would become history's largest empire began not with conquest, but with commerce. In 1373, the Kingdom of England and Portugal established an alliance that endures to this day, the oldest continuous diplomatic relationship in European history. This Treaty of London, signed by King Edward III and King Ferdinand and Queen Eleanor of Portugal, initially served to counter Castilian power, but evolved into a crucial commercial partnership. Through this connection, merchants from the British Isles gained access to Portuguese maritime knowledge at a crucial moment when European powers gazed increasingly toward distant horizons. Medieval Britain showed little indication of future imperial ambitions. Preoccupied with continental wars and internal conflicts, Tudor monarchs focused on consolidating power within their island realm. The 100 Years' War with France drained royal coffers, while the Wars of the Roses devastated the nobility. When Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field in 1485, establishing the Tudor dynasty, his realm remained a peripheral European power of modest international significance. Maritime ambition remained similarly modest during these early years. While Spain and Portugal divided the non-European world between them with papal blessing in the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, the Tudor monarchy focused primarily on defending its own shores and maintaining traditional wool trade with Flanders. Yet beneath this apparent caution stirred restless ambition. This island nation, perched at Europe's edge, possessed natural advantages for seafaring. No point within the realm lies more than 70 miles from the coast, and its many harbours provided shelter for growing merchant fleets. The late 15th century witnessed dramatic shifts in European power dynamics. Columbus's 1492 voyage for Spain opened American horizons, while Portuguese navigators established direct sea routes to India around Africa. These developments threatened to bypass traditional Mediterranean and overland trade routes upon which British merchants had relied. Continental powers were claiming vast territories across oceans, raising the spectre of isolation from emerging global trade networks. Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty, recognized potential in Atlantic exploration. Cautious by nature, this pragmatic monarch nonetheless understood commercial opportunity. In 1497, he commissioned John Giovanni Caboto, a Venetian navigator, to seek western passages to Asia's riches. Sailing in the tiny vessel Matthew with just 18 crew members, Cabot reached Newfoundland, claiming these territories for the crown and establishing the first British claim in North America, a modest beginning for what would become a global empire. Though Cabot's discoveries disappointed those seeking Asian wealth, they revealed rich fishing grounds off Newfoundland. By the early 16th century, fishing fleets from Bristol and other ports made seasonal voyages to harvest cod, drying their catch on shorelines before returning home. These humble fishing expeditions quietly established a British presence in North American waters. Meanwhile, Spanish conquistadors extracted vast mineral wealth from Mexico and Peru, fueling envy and ambition among Tudor subjects. Tales of Aztec and Inca gold circulated through London, stoking dreams of similar riches. Religious upheaval transformed Britain's relationship with Europe, and consequently its imperial trajectory. Henry VIII's break with Rome in the 1530s cast his kingdom as a Protestant outsider among Catholic powers. This theological schism carried profound geopolitical implications. Cut off from Catholic alliance networks and facing potential crusades, the realm required new defensive strategies. The dissolution of monasteries transferred vast wealth to the crown and created a new landowning class eager for investment opportunities, including overseas ventures. Following Henry's death in 1547, the realm experienced religious whiplash. Edward VI's Protestant reforms gave way to Mary I's Catholic restoration, during which hundreds of Protestants were executed. When Elizabeth I ascended the throne in 1558, she inherited a vulnerable nation threatened by continental rivals, particularly Spain, which viewed the island kingdom as a heretical state ripe for invasion. Under these pressures, the Tudor monarchy cultivated naval strength as its primary defense, initiating a maritime focus that would later support imperial expansion. The search for alternative trade routes intensified during Elizabeth's reign. Explorer Martin Frobisher launched 3 expeditions seeking the elusive Northwest Passage to Asia between 1576 and 1578. Navigating treacherous Arctic waters, Frobisher discovered what is now Frobisher Bay in Baffin Island, Canada. His voyages ended in financial disaster when ship holds full of supposed gold ore proved worthless, yet they demonstrated the islanders' willingness to risk lives and capital in pursuit of commercial advantage. John Davis pushed even farther north in 3 voyages, between 1585 and 1587, reaching 72 degrees north latitude. Both Frobisher and Davis failed to discover viable routes to Asia, yet established a presence in Arctic waters and developed navigational techniques for challenging environments. Their expeditions exemplified the intertwining of scientific inquiry, commercial ambition, and national pride that would characterize later imperial ventures. Continental constraints, meanwhile, pushed Tudor entrepreneurs toward institutional innovation. The Muscovy Company, chartered in 1555, following Richard Chancellor's expedition to Russia, sought overland connections to China through Russian territories. This joint stock corporation represented a crucial development in British commercial evolution, the first major trading corporation and a prototype for future imperial enterprises. Through this company, merchants learned to pool capital, share risk, and operate under royal charter in distant lands, establishing organizational templates later employed globally. Anthony Jenkinson, a Muscovy Company agent, traveled extensively through Russia and into Persia during the 1660s, seeking trade routes to Central Asia. Though he never reached China, Jenkinson established commercial presence in regions previously dominated by Italian and Ottoman merchants. The company's modest successes demonstrated possibilities for trade beyond traditional European markets, even when lacking military might comparable to continental powers. Privateer captains like Francis Drake and John Hawkins embodied the Tudor monarchy's opportunistic approach to overseas expansion. Operating with royal blessing but minimal official control, these sailor entrepreneurs raided Spanish ships and settlements across the Atlantic. Drake's audacious raids on Spanish Pacific territories demonstrated growing maritime capability while enriching investors, including Elizabeth herself. His circumnavigation of the globe, 1577 to 1580, brought plunder and geographic knowledge, elevating him from pirate to national hero through knighthood. Elizabeth's government maintained official deniability regarding privateer activities, while secretly encouraging and investing in them. This approach, using private enterprise as an unofficial arm of state power, would reappear throughout British imperial history. Drake and his contemporaries served as cost-effective naval auxiliaries, disrupting Spanish shipping without requiring crown financing. Their profits stimulated interest in overseas ventures among the island's elites, creating constituencies favoring maritime expansion. John Hawkins pioneered involvement in the Atlantic slave trade with 3 voyages between 1562 and 1569, transporting enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. Hawkins initiated participation in the triangular trade that would later expand dramatically. His final voyage ended in disaster at San Juan de Ulua, Mexico, when Spanish forces attacked his fleet, killing many crew members. The young Francis Drake narrowly escaped this defeat, developing an enduring hatred of Spain that fueled his later raids. While privateers harassed Spanish shipping, other entrepreneurs attempted early colonization efforts. Sir Humphrey Gilbert received a patent in 1578 to establish North American settlements. After an initial failed expedition, Gilbert claimed Newfoundland for the crown in 1583, but drowned while returning home. His half-brother, Walter Raleigh, inherited his colonial ambitions and royal favor. Roanoke Colony represented the first serious attempt at North American settlement. Under Raleigh's sponsorship and with Elizabeth's blessing, expeditions in 1585 attempted to establish a permanent presence on Roanoke Island, present-day North Carolina. Artist John White created detailed illustrations of indigenous peoples and native flora and fauna, providing the first visual record of North American environments. The colony struggled with supplies and indigenous relations. When White returned to Britain for provisions, Anglo-Spanish War delayed his return for 3 years. Upon finally reaching Roanoke in 1590, White discovered the settlement mysteriously abandoned. All 115 colonists vanished, leaving only the enigmatic carving Croatoan on a post. This lost colony became an enduring mystery, with theories ranging from massacre to assimilation into indigenous communities. Despite its failure, Roanoke set important precedents for future colonization efforts. The venture demonstrated both the challenges of overseas settlement and the determination to establish North American footholds despite setbacks. Richard Hakluyt's Discourse on Western Planting articulated early justifications for colonization, arguing that American settlements would provide markets for domestic goods, employment for the poor, and strategic advantages against Spain. Hakluyt's writings represented emerging imperial ideologies that combined economic opportunity, national security, and religious purpose. As a priest and scholar, Hakluyt presented colonization as both commercially advantageous and divinely sanctioned, a Protestant mission to counter Catholic Spain's influence in the Americas. Anglo-Spanish rivalry culminated in 1588, when Philip II launched his invincible armada to invade the island nation, depose Elizabeth, and restore Catholicism. The Spanish assembled 130 ships carrying 30,000 men, an overwhelming force compared to Elizabeth's smaller navy. Yet in the Channel, her captains exploited their vessels' superior maneuverability and rate of fire. These smaller, more agile ships outfought the Spanish fleet, aided by fortuitous weather that contemporaries dubbed the Protestant wind. Fire ships sent among the anchored Spanish vessels created panic, scattering the formation. The Spanish defeat transformed Britain's self-perception. Though largely defensive, the victory suggested divine favor for Protestantism against Catholic Spain, what contemporary pamphlets described as God's protection of a chosen nation. Naval technology, tactics, and confidence all advanced significantly, setting foundations for future maritime dominance. Naval commanders like Drake, Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher assumed near-mythic status in popular imagination, creating cultural associations between national identity and maritime prowess that would persist for centuries. Elizabeth's reign witnessed early experiments with colonization in Ireland, a laboratory for imperial practices later employed globally. Her government established plantations in Munster and later Ulster, displacing native Irish and importing loyal Protestant settlers from Britain. This strategy, conquest, displacement, plantation, would later repeat across continents. Ireland thus became the first colony, where methods of control through cultural suppression, land appropriation, and population management were refined. The Irish experience introduced concepts later central to imperial governance: civilizing missions to justify conquest, legal frameworks distinguishing natives from settlers, and administrative structures for controlling territories beyond traditional borders. Writers like Edmund Spenser, who participated in the Munster plantation, developed justifications for displacing barbarous peoples, rhetoric later applied to indigenous populations worldwide. Ireland served as both testing ground and template for approaching the subjugation of diverse populations. As the 16th century drew to a close, growing commercial interests demanded institutional structure. On December 31st, 1600, Elizabeth granted a royal charter to the Governor and Company of Merchants of London, trading into the East Indies, the East India Company. Created merely to compete in the spice trade against Dutch and Portuguese competitors, this joint stock corporation would eventually administer vast territories and command armies larger than Britain's own, becoming the primary vehicle of power in Asia. The East India Company's charter exemplified the public-private partnership characteristic of early imperialism. The Crown granted monopoly trading rights and limited legal autonomy, while merchants provided capital and assumed financial risks. Few present at its founding could have imagined this commercial enterprise would transform into history's most remarkable corporate empire, eventually governing hundreds of millions of subjects across the Indian subcontinent. Unlike Spain's conquest-centered imperialism, the Tudor approach to overseas involvement remained primarily commercial and opportunistic, rather than territorial throughout the 16th century. Spanish conquistadors sought gold, glory, and God, establishing viceroyalties administered directly by crown officials. By contrast, the British established scattered trading posts rather than conquered provinces, sought profit rather than conversion or settlement, and relied on private initiative rather than state planning. This pragmatic, commerce-driven approach would characterize much imperial expansion in subsequent centuries, distinguishing it from more centralized European empires. The Tudor state lacking resources for direct colonial administration, leveraged private enterprise through charters, patents, and privateering commissions. This approach distributed costs and risks while allowing flexibility, though it sometimes created conflicting directives and inconsistent policies. As Elizabeth's reign ended in 1603, her kingdom possessed no formal colonies beyond Ireland, controlled no overseas territories, and maintained only tenuous footholds in international trade networks dominated by others. Yet crucial elements for future expansion were now in place: growing naval capability, experienced maritime leaders, institutional frameworks for commercial ventures, and national confidence fostered by survival against continental threats. These ingredients, combined with Protestant entrepreneurial energy and intense commercial rivalries, created conditions for unprecedented imperial growth in the century ahead. The death of Elizabeth marked not just the end of the Tudor dynasty, but the transition from a defensive, insular realm to an increasingly confident and expansive Britain. The seeds of empire had been planted, though none could foresee the global dominion they would eventually yield. The passing of Elizabeth and the accession of James the Skik of Scotland to the English throne as James I in 1603 marked the beginning of a new imperial era. Under this first Stuart monarch, tentative overseas ventures transformed into deliberate colonial enterprises. Having united the crowns of England and Scotland, James styled himself King of Great Britain. Though formal political union remained a century away, this new composite identity, however awkward in its early form, would become the banner under which a global empire later expanded. Early 17th century colonization differed markedly from modern conceptions of empire. Rather than state-directed conquest, colonial ventures operated primarily through chartered companies and proprietary grants to wealthy individuals. The Virginia Company of London exemplified this approach. Granted a royal charter in 1606, the company aimed to establish profitable settlements in North America while extending influence across the Atlantic. Jamestown, founded May 1607 on a peninsula along the James River, represented the first permanent European settlement in North America under the Crown's authority. The colony's early years proved disastrous. Chosen for defensibility rather than agricultural potential, the swampy location fostered disease. Relations with the powerful Powhatan Confederacy alternated between trade and violent conflict. Starvation claimed numerous lives during the starving time of 1609 to 1610, reducing the population from roughly 500 to 60 settlers. Rumors of cannibalism, later confirmed by archaeological evidence, illustrated the desperate conditions these early colonists faced. The Virginia colony survived largely through two crucial adaptations. First, under the leadership of Captain John Smith, who famously declared that "he who does not work shall not eat." The settlement imposed military discipline on formerly genteel colonists unaccustomed to manual labor. Second, and more significantly, the discovery that tobacco could be profitably cultivated transformed economic prospects. By 1614, Virginia tobacco began arriving in London's ports, launching a lucrative trade that ensured the colony's commercial viability. Tobacco cultivation dramatically reshaped Virginia society. The labor-intensive crop required more workers than migration from the homeland alone could supply. Initially, this need was met through indentured servitude, with poor laborers from the British Isles exchanging 4 to 7 years of work for passage to America and land thereafter. As demand grew, colonial leaders turned increasingly toward African labor. Though the legal distinction between servitude and slavery remained initially fluid, by mid-century racial bondage began hardening into a hereditary institution. The arrival of approximately 20 enslaved Africans aboard a Dutch vessel at Point Comfort in August 1619 marked a pivotal moment in North American history. Though initially treated similarly to indentured servants, these individuals represented the vanguard of a labor system that would fundamentally shape colonial development. Within decades, permanent racial slavery emerged as the dominant form of plantation labor, laying foundations for centuries of exploitation and resistance. That same year witnessed another development crucial to Virginia's future: the establishment of the House of Burgesses, the first representative assembly in the American colonies. Though limited to property-owning men, this assembly established precedents for self-government that would characterize settlements throughout North America. This seemingly paradoxical combination, democratic institutions for white colonists, alongside intensifying racial bondage, exemplified contradictions that would persist throughout the imperial project. By mid-century, the North American foothold expanded considerably. Massachusetts Bay Colony, established by Puritans seeking religious autonomy from the Anglican Church, grew rapidly after its founding in 1630. Unlike Virginia's scattered plantations, Massachusetts developed around town-centered communities where religious conformity was strictly enforced. Within decades, settlements spread throughout New England, establishing distinctive regional cultures that would persist for centuries. Unlike the Spanish emphasis on extracting precious metals from their American possessions, these new colonies focused primarily on agricultural exports and maritime commerce. This economic orientation fostered different colonial societies, less dominated by royal officials and more characterized by local governance and commercial opportunities for colonists themselves. While Spain's empire remained highly centralized, these expanding territories developed substantial autonomy, laying groundwork for later tensions with the mother country. Caribbean colonization proceeded simultaneously with North American ventures. Barbados, claimed for the crown in 1625, initially relied on small farms worked by European settlers and servants. The introduction of sugar cultivation in the 1640s transformed the island dramatically. Drawing from Dutch experience in Brazil, Barbadian planters adopted labor-intensive sugar production that demanded far more workers than white immigration could provide. By 1660, the island had imported thousands of enslaved Africans, establishing the plantation model later replicated throughout the Caribbean. Sugar production proved immensely profitable. Barbados, merely 21 miles long by 14 miles wide, became one of the wealthiest colonies in the empire, generating enormous returns for absentee planters who frequently returned home after making their fortunes. The human cost proved equally enormous. Brutal working conditions, tropical diseases, and inadequate nutrition resulted in appalling mortality rates among enslaved laborers, necessitating continuous importation of enslaved Africans to maintain workforce numbers. Jamaica significantly expanded Caribbean holdings when Admiral William Penn and General Robert Venables captured the island from Spain in 1655. Though originally tasked with attacking Hispaniola, their forces suffered defeat there before successfully seizing the lightly defended Jamaica. Despite initial disappointment with this consolation prize, Jamaica eventually developed into the most valuable Caribbean possession, its sugar plantations generating immense wealth through enslaved labor. Naval rivalry with the Dutch shaped imperial development throughout the mid-17th century. 3 Anglo-Dutch wars between 1652 and 1674 contested commercial supremacy and colonial possessions. During these conflicts, the Navigation Acts of 1651 and 1660 aimed to secure trade advantages by requiring colonial goods to be shipped on vessels registered in the kingdom or those belonging to the producing country. These protectionist measures targeted Dutch shipping dominance and bound colonies more tightly to metropolitan economic interests. One significant result of Anglo-Dutch conflict came in 1664, when forces under the Duke of York seized New Netherland, renaming it New York after the Duke himself, later James II. This acquisition secured a strategically valuable territory between New England and the Chesapeake colonies, while adding diverse populations, Dutch, Swedish, German, and various African and indigenous peoples, to the growing ranks of imperial subjects. The relatively peaceful conquest demonstrated how European colonial rivalries often determined territorial control, with little regard for non-European inhabitants. Overseas expansion continued despite significant domestic turmoil. The civil wars, the execution of Charles I in 1649, Oliver Cromwell's protectorate, and the restoration of monarchy under Charles II in 1660 all occurred amid colonial growth. This pattern illustrated how imperial development often proceeded through private enterprise despite political upheavals at home. While the state's involvement in colonization fluctuated with changing regimes, merchants, planters, and settlers maintained expanding commercial networks. The Restoration period saw systematic development of imperial administration. The Duke of York received proprietorship of New York. William Penn established Pennsylvania as a Quaker colony in 1681. Carolina, granted to 8 lords proprietors in 1663, developed plantation agriculture in its southern regions, while its northern areas relied more on small farms and naval stores. These proprietary colonies, though owing allegiance to the crown, operated under substantial control of their proprietors, creating varied governance models throughout the American colonies. Royal oversight increased during this period. The Navigation Acts gained stricter enforcement. The Lords of Trade, established in 1675, and later the Lords of Trade and Plantations, developed as specialized bodies overseeing colonial affairs. Colonial policies increasingly reflected mercantile principles aiming to extract maximum economic benefit for the mother country, while preventing colonial manufacturing that might compete with home industries. The foundation of the Royal African Company in 1672 formalized participation in the Atlantic slave trade under royal monopoly. Granted exclusive rights to trade with Africa, the company transported thousands of enslaved Africans to American plantations annually. When its monopoly ended in 1698, independent traders entered the traffic, dramatically increasing the volume of human cargo. By the early 18th century, slave traders flying the Union Jack dominated the transatlantic slave trade, eventually transporting over 3 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, more than any other European nation. Alongside Atlantic developments, commercial interests expanded in Asia through the East India Company. Initially focused on acquiring spices, company agents established trading posts at Surat in 1613 and Madras in 1639. Unlike their aggressive Portuguese and Dutch competitors, the company initially relied on diplomacy rather than military force, securing trading privileges from local rulers. The company established Fort William at Calcutta in 1696, creating another foothold that would later become a center of power in India. Competition with the French East India Company intensified throughout this period. Both nations sought commercial advantages through alliances with local Indian powers rather than territorial control. This approach reflected the reality that European military forces remained small compared to powerful Indian states like the Mughal Empire. the company operated primarily as a trading enterprise, though it increasingly required armed factories and vessels to protect its commerce from European rivals and local interference. Indigenous resistance shaped colonial development throughout distant territories. In North America, the Anglo-Powhatan Wars in Virginia, King Philip's War in New England, and numerous smaller conflicts demonstrated Native American determination to resist encroachment. These wars resulted in significant casualties on both sides, but ultimately facilitated colonial expansion through treaties that transferred land to European settlements. The colonists' growing numerical advantage, combined with devastating epidemics among indigenous populations, gradually shifted power balances. King Philip's War illustrated these dynamics. Between 1675 and 1678, a coalition of indigenous nations led by Metacom, called King Philip by the colonists, challenged New England's expansion. The conflict resulted in proportionally more deaths than any subsequent American war, decimating native populations while destroying numerous colonial towns. Though ultimately defeated, Metacom's resistance temporarily halted frontier expansion and demonstrated the fierce indigenous opposition that colonization encountered. Religious and ethnic diversity characterized these emerging colonies, despite official preferences for Anglican conformity. Puritans dominated New England. Catholics found refuge in Maryland until Protestant majorities restricted their rights. Quakers established Pennsylvania as a haven for persecuted religious minorities. Jewish communities established synagogues in Newport, New York, and Charleston. Various Protestant dissenters, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, established congregations throughout the colonies. This religious pluralism, though often contested, distinguished these possessions from the more religiously homogeneous Spanish Empire. Colonial governance blended metropolitan control with local autonomy. Royal governors represented crown authority but required cooperation from colonial assemblies that controlled local taxation and expenditures. This tension between imperial oversight and self-government created ongoing negotiations of power. Colonial elites developed increasing confidence in their right to manage internal affairs, while acknowledging sovereign authority in foreign relations and trade regulation. These arrangements established precedents for later conflicts over the boundaries of imperial authority. Bacon's rebellion in Virginia during 1676 to 1677 highlighted social tensions within maturing colonies. Led by Nathaniel Bacon against Governor William Berkeley, the uprising began as a dispute over Native American policy, but evolved into a broader challenge to elite governance. Frontier settlers, servants, and small farmers temporarily seized power, burning Jamestown before royal forces restored order. In its aftermath, Virginia's elite increasingly favored enslaved African labor over European indentured servants, partially to prevent future cross-racial alliances among the laboring classes. Imperial reforms followed the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 1689, which replaced James II with William and Mary. The new monarchs approved Massachusetts' new charter in 1691, which absorbed Plymouth Colony and established more direct royal control while maintaining a degree of self-government. Similar arrangements in other colonies created a patchwork imperial system that balanced metropolitan oversight with colonial traditions of local autonomy, creating governance models distinct from centralized Spanish and French empires. The 1690s witnessed the beginning of imperial warfare that would continue intermittently for over a century. King William's War, the North American extension of the War of the League of Augsburg, initiated colonial involvement in broader European conflicts. French and allied Native American forces raided New England frontier settlements, while colonial militias attacked French positions in Canada. These conflicts established patterns of frontier warfare, where European imperial rivalries intertwined with indigenous alliances and local territorial ambitions. While establishing Atlantic colonies, imperial ambitions also expanded into the Mediterranean. The acquisition of Tangier through Catherine of Braganza's dowry in 1661 provided a naval base controlling the Strait of Gibraltar, though it was abandoned in 1684 due to high maintenance costs. More lastingly, Gibraltar itself fell to Anglo-Dutch forces in 1704 during the War of Spanish Succession. This strategic acquisition, retained in subsequent peace treaties, secured influence at the Mediterranean's entrance and became a symbol of naval power. Scotland's failed imperial venture dramatically altered constitutional arrangements within the British Isles. The Company of Scotland, established in 1695, attempted to establish a colony at Darien on the Isthmus of Panama. The enterprise, absorbing between a quarter and half of Scotland's available capital, collapsed disastrously by 1700 due to disease, Spanish hostility, and obstruction from London. The financial catastrophe weakened Scottish resistance to political union with England, contributing significantly to the 1707 Act of Union that created Great Britain as a unified state. This Act of Union transformed the nature of empire by creating a truly British, rather than simply English imperial project. Scottish merchants, soldiers, administrators, and settlers subsequently participated enthusiastically in imperial expansion, often disproportionately to Scotland's population. The Union increased human and financial resources while reducing potential continental interference through Scotland. Though initially controversial in both countries, the Union created a more powerful imperial state, capable of challenging French global ambitions. By 1707, when England and Scotland formally united, the Crown possessed a scattered but valuable collection of overseas territories. The Atlantic colonies comprised a diverse assemblage: sugar islands in the Caribbean, generating enormous wealth through enslaved labor; North American settlements exporting tobacco, rice, furs, and fish, while developing distinctive political traditions; trading posts along Africa's coast facilitating the slave trade; and the beginnings of commercial footholds in India. Though lacking the territorial extent of Spanish America, these possessions laid foundations for unprecedented imperial expansion in the century ahead. The first century of colonization established patterns that would characterize the empire throughout its existence. Private enterprise generally preceded state involvement. Commercial interests drove expansion more than strategic planning. Racial hierarchies emerged to justify exploitation of non-European peoples. Colonial governance combined metropolitan authority with local autonomy. Religious pluralism flourished despite official preferences. Indigenous resistance shaped development throughout imperial territories. These defining features, established during this formative period, would evolve but never entirely disappear as the empire expanded globally in subsequent centuries. The Act of Union in 1707 forged a newly unified kingdom, ready to challenge European rivals on the global stage. The formal merger of England and Scotland created not just a unified domestic market, but a combined overseas project with expanded human and financial resources. Queen Anne now ruled a realm of approximately 8.5 million people, with territories stretching from North America to India. Though still smaller than France in population and military strength, the United Kingdom possessed crucial advantages in this age of competition: naval supremacy, commercial expertise, and financial innovation. The Royal Navy emerged as the primary instrument of power. Following naval reforms under Charles II, the fleet had grown in both size and professionalism. By Anne's reign, maritime dominance had become central to strategic thinking. The capture of Gibraltar and Minorca secured Mediterranean bases that projected power far beyond home waters. Naval vessels not only fought opposing fleets, but also protected merchant shipping, bombarded coastal fortifications, transported troops, and conducted diplomacy with distant rulers. Financial innovation proved equally crucial to success. The Bank of England, established in 1694, provided stable credit mechanisms that funded naval expansion and military operations. The development of national debt, managed through a sinking fund system, allowed the government to borrow unprecedented sums at lower interest rates than continental rivals. Meanwhile, London's insurance markets, stock exchange, and banking houses created sophisticated financial tools that mobilized private capital for overseas ventures. This financial revolution, more than military might alone, underpinned global ambitions. The War of Spanish Succession highlighted these emerging advantages. While continental allies provided most land forces, the Royal Navy secured vital victories at sea. Admiral Rooke's capture of Gibraltar proved an enduring strategic gain. North American expeditions targeted French Canada and Spanish Florida, though with limited success. The Treaty of Utrecht delivered significant prizes. Gibraltar and Minorca remained in royal hands, while Spain granted the valuable Asiento contract, the right to supply 4,800 enslaved Africans annually to Spanish America. The Asiento dramatically expanded involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. The South Sea Company, formed specifically to exploit this contract, joined the Royal African Company and numerous independent traders in trafficking humans across the Atlantic. By the 1720s, vessels flying the Union Jack carried more enslaved Africans than those of any other nation. Liverpool, Bristol, and London developed into major slaving ports, where merchants amassed fortunes through this brutal commerce. Between 1700 and 1800, ships transported roughly 2.5 million enslaved Africans to plantations in the Americas, with horrific mortality rates during the infamous Middle Passage. Trade expanded dramatically following Utrecht. The triangular commerce between Europe, Africa, and the Americas generated immense wealth. Manufactured goods sent to Africa were exchanged for enslaved people who were transported to plantation regions producing sugar, tobacco, and other tropical commodities for European markets. A parallel exchange saw North American fish, lumber, and agricultural products traded for Caribbean sugar and molasses, which supplied a growing rum industry. These complex commercial patterns bound distant territories together in networks of exploitation and exchange. The Navigation Act structured this commercial system. These laws, refined through multiple revisions, required overseas trade to pass through metropolitan ports on ships owned and largely crewed by subjects of the Crown. While often evaded through smuggling, these restrictions nevertheless directed commerce toward London and other domestic ports, creating jobs for sailors, longshoremen, warehouse workers, and shipbuilders. Tropical products fueled growing manufacturing industries, while overseas territories provided markets for metropolitan textiles, metal goods, and manufactured products. Sugar dominated this mercantile system in value. West Indian plantations in Jamaica, Barbados, and the Leeward Islands produced extraordinary wealth for absentee planters, who often returned home to purchase landed estates and parliamentary seats. These Caribbean islands, though small in territory, generated greater revenue than the more populous mainland settlements. Jamaica alone produced more wealth than all 13 North American territories combined. This prosperity came at devastating human cost. The sugar economy literally consumed enslaved lives, requiring constant new imports due to horrific mortality rates. North American territories, meanwhile, developed diverse economies. New England specialized in shipbuilding, fishing, and maritime trade, including significant commerce with the French and Spanish Caribbean. The middle regions produced grain, timber, and livestock. The Chesapeake specialized in tobacco, while the Carolinas exported rice, indigo, and naval stores such as pitch and tar. Georgia, established as a buffer against Spanish Florida, initially prohibited slavery but abandoned this restriction as plantation agriculture spread southward. Populations grew rapidly through both natural increase and immigration. Non-English Europeans, Germans, Scots-Irish, Dutch, French Huguenots, and others established communities throughout the mainland. Forced migration of enslaved Africans dramatically altered demographics, particularly in southern plantation regions. Black populations outnumbered whites in South Carolina and approached half the population in Virginia. Indigenous peoples remained majority populations beyond coastal settlement zones, but faced increasing pressure as settlements expanded westward. The East India Company simultaneously expanded operations in South Asia. Following the death of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, central authority in India weakened, creating opportunities for European commercial expansion. Company representatives negotiated with regional powers for trading privileges, gradually developing political influence alongside commercial activities. Robert Clive's victory at Plassey over the Nawab of Bengal transformed the company from trader to territorial power, initiating a new phase of direct rule over millions of Indian subjects. International rivalry intensified throughout this period, with France emerging as the primary competitor. The War of Austrian Succession saw significant fighting in North America, known locally as King George's War. Local militias supported by Royal Navy forces captured the French fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island, only to see it returned to France in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. Such diplomatic compromises frustrated Americans who increasingly viewed conflicts through regional rather than European perspectives. The company established a system of indirect rule in Bengal after Plassey. While maintaining the facade of Mughal authority, company officials controlled revenue collection, trade regulation, and gradually justice administration. The Diwani, right to collect revenue, granted by the Mughal emperor, legitimized this control. Company servants enriched themselves through private trade and gifts from local authorities, while the company itself struggled financially despite territorial acquisitions. This contradiction between institutional poverty and individual enrichment characterized early governance in India. The transformation from commercial enterprise to governing institution occurred unevenly and opportunistically, rather than through deliberate planning. Military forces, initially maintained solely to protect trading posts, expanded into armies that intervened in local succession disputes, usually backing candidates who offered favorable trading terms. Company territory grew through a combination of military conquest, treaties with local rulers, and legal agreements with weakening Mughal authorities. This piecemeal expansion created administrative challenges that the trading company was ill-equipped to address. The 7 Years' War represented a crucial turning point in global expansion. Though ostensibly fought over European dynastic issues, the conflict became a truly worldwide struggle for dominance. William Pitt the Elder, recognizing the commercial importance of overseas possessions, directed unprecedented resources toward distant theaters. His strategy emphasized naval power and campaigns abroad, while providing financial subsidies to European allies like Prussia to maintain continental pressure on France. North American fighting began even before formal declarations of war. Competing claims in the Ohio Valley led to clashes between local militias and French forces. A young George Washington surrendered to French troops at Fort Necessity, while General Braddock's subsequent expedition ended in disastrous defeat. Initially, French forces and their indigenous allies dominated the conflict, capturing several forts. However, the tide gradually turned as superior naval power enabled the transport of regular army regiments across the Atlantic. The conflict dramatically shifted power balances in North America. The capture of Louisbourg provided a base for operations against Quebec, which fell to General Wolfe's forces after a daring assault on the Plains of Abraham. Both Wolfe and his French counterpart Montcalm died in the battle. Montreal surrendered the following year, effectively ending French power in Canada. Meanwhile, expeditions captured France's Caribbean sugar islands, including Guadeloupe and Martinique, though some were later returned in peace negotiations. Military forces made equally decisive gains in India. Robert Clive secured Bengal for the company, while Sir Eyre Coote defeated French forces under Comte de Lally at Wandiwash. The subsequent capture of Pondicherry effectively eliminated French power in South India. Unlike the temporary conquests of earlier conflicts, these victories produced lasting territorial changes. The Treaty of Paris formalized these gains, awarding Canada and eastern Louisiana to the Crown, while returning some Caribbean islands to France in exchange for other concessions. The 7 Years' War transformed the extent and nature of overseas holdings. The defeat of France eliminated the primary rival for dominance in North America and India. Spanish participation late in the conflict led to the capture of Havana and Manila, though both were returned at the peace in exchange for Florida. The realm now stretched across multiple continents, encompassing diverse populations and requiring new approaches to governance. Victory brought unprecedented power, but also new challenges of administration and finance. War debts shaped policy in the conflict's aftermath. The national debt nearly doubled to £132 million, requiring increased taxation and fiscal restraint. Parliamentary attention turned toward making overseas possessions more profitable and forcing them to bear a larger share of defense costs. The Proclamation of 1763 temporarily prohibited settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains, aiming to reduce expensive frontier conflicts with indigenous nations. This restriction frustrated land speculators and settlers with Western ambitions, creating tensions with American elites. Administrative reforms attempted to rationalize governance. The establishment of a board of trade and a new American department reflected the growing complexity of managing distant territories. In India, parliamentary investigation into company corruption led to limited reforms, though significant changes awaited the governance failures of later decades. New officials arrived in America, charged with enforcing trade regulations that had previously been only loosely implemented, creating friction with merchants accustomed to operating with minimal oversight. The Atlantic territories now encompassed millions of non-English peoples, necessitating new strategies of control. Quebec Act accommodated French-Canadian linguistic and religious practices, a pragmatic approach to governing the approximately 70,000 French settlers now under Crown rule. In Florida, similar accommodations extended to Spanish Catholics. These measures reflected an emerging recognition that direct cultural assimilation might be impractical for governing diverse populations, though they prompted concerns among Protestant Americans about religious tolerance toward Catholicism. Indigenous nations confronted changed circumstances after French removal. The Ottawa leader Pontiac led a pan-tribal resistance movement, capturing most western forts and threatening frontier settlements. Though eventually defeated, this uprising influenced the Proclamation Line decision and demonstrated continuing Indigenous power. Without the option of playing European powers against each other, Native American nations developed new strategies of resistance and accommodation, though their bargaining position had fundamentally weakened. New taxes provoked American resistance. The Sugar Act imposed duties on molasses, while establishing vice admiralty courts to prosecute smugglers without local juries. The Stamp Act required tax stamps on legal documents, newspapers, and other paper items, directly affecting professionals and publishers who organized effective resistance through boycotts and intimidation of stamp distributors. The Declaratory Act, accompanying the Stamp Act's repeal, asserted parliamentary authority to legislate for all territories in all cases whatsoever, a claim Americans increasingly rejected. The growing crisis revealed differing conceptions of governance. Parliamentary supremacy, widely accepted at home as the foundation of constitutional order after the Glorious Revolution, conflicted with American understandings that emphasized local assemblies' traditional rights to approve taxation. Resistance increasingly employed the language of English liberties and constitutional principles, claiming the rights of freeborn subjects rather than rejecting connection entirely. This constitutional crisis reflected the failure to develop coherent principles for incorporating distant territories. The Townshend duties imposed indirect taxes on imported glass, paint, paper, and tea, prompting renewed boycotts. The stationing of troops in Boston led to growing tensions culminating in the Boston Massacre, when soldiers fired on a crowd, killing 5 civilians. Though Parliament repealed most Townshend duties, the tea tax remained as a symbolic assertion of authority. The Boston Tea Party, the destruction of East India Company tea by protesters disguised as Native Americans, triggered punitive measures known as the Coercive Acts or Intolerable Acts in America. The Quebec Act, passed alongside these measures, extended Quebec's boundaries to include the Ohio Valley, while recognizing Catholic rights and French civil law. Though unrelated to the developing crisis with the 13 mainland territories, its timing and provisions inflamed American opinion. Protestant settlers viewed the Catholic accommodations as evidence of royal antipathy toward traditional liberties, while land speculators objected to the Ohio Valley's placement under Quebec jurisdiction. These measures intensified cooperation through the Continental Congress. The administration failed to appreciate how American societies had evolved. Mainland settlements contained over 2 million European inhabitants with distinct regional identities and increasing economic self-sufficiency. Local elites, educated in Enlightenment principles and experienced in self-government through regional assemblies, rejected the notion that Parliament could arbitrarily impose policies without their consent. Distance had created divergent political cultures that authorities inadequately understood. Commercial interests complicated the emerging conflict. American commerce remained oriented toward metropolitan markets, while local elites maintained business connections and cultural affinities with the homeland. Many prominent figures initially sought reconciliation rather than independence. Economic boycotts were designed to pressure Parliament through metropolitan merchants who suffered from interrupted trade. Only after failed petitions and escalating military confrontation did independence emerge as the dominant position among American leaders. Even as transatlantic relations deteriorated, expansion continued on other frontiers. Captain James Cook's Pacific voyages mapped vast oceanic regions while claiming Australia for the crown. The East India Company consolidated control in Bengal, while expanding influence in other Indian regions. These simultaneous developments demonstrated how operations continued across multiple frontiers simultaneously, with crises in one region often occurring alongside expansion in others. Caribbean and Canadian territories remained loyal during the American conflict, highlighting regional diversity. West Indian planters, dependent on naval protection and metropolitan markets, saw little advantage in independence despite sharing many grievances with mainland Americans about trade restrictions. French Canadians, recently brought under Crown rule, remained neutral or loyal rather than joining their former enemies. These variations revealed how economic structures, cultural differences, and strategic considerations produced different responses to policy. The revolution that began at Lexington and Concord represented not just a rebellion, but a constitutional crisis for the entire overseas system. The Declaration of Independence articulated a devastating critique of monarchical government, while establishing principles of consent and natural rights that would influence subsequent independence movements elsewhere. Though framed as a response to specific grievances, the revolution raised fundamental questions about the legitimacy of distant rule that would resurface repeatedly in later history. By 1776, the realm stood at a pivotal crossroads. Military forces fought to retain the 13 mainland territories, while administering vastly expanded lands from the Mississippi to Bengal. The mercantile system that had structured trade for a century faced its first major challenge. Governance practices developed for smaller, more homogeneous possessions struggled to adapt to the administration of millions of French, Spanish, indigenous, and Indian subjects. The American crisis revealed tensions inherent in governing distant territories through representative institutions, tensions that would require new approaches in the century ahead. When 56 delegates to the Continental Congress signed the Declaration of Independence, few observers expected their rebellion to succeed. The monarchy commanded the world's strongest navy, professional armies, considerable financial resources, and a global network of territories and allies. The rebellious territories, though populous by New World standards with around 2.5 million inhabitants, possessed no regular army, no navy, minimal manufacturing capacity, and limited diplomatic connections. Yet within 7 years, these seemingly mismatched antagonists would sign a peace treaty recognizing American independence, fundamentally altering the trajectory of global history. This extraordinary outcome resulted from a complex interplay of factors. The struggle represented both a conventional military contest and an unprecedented political challenge. Fighting a war 3,000 miles from home created logistical difficulties that even the most powerful European nations struggled to overcome. The vast North American landscape, with its sprawling geography, dense forests, and scattered settlements, favored defensive operations and guerrilla tactics over traditional European battlefield approaches. Geography dictated strategy. The Crown's forces needed to control key ports and waterways, particularly the Hudson River corridor that could isolate New England from other rebellious regions. After driving Continental forces from New York in 1776, General William Howe pursued a conservative strategy aimed at occupying major population centers rather than destroying Washington's army. This approach, while securing Philadelphia in 1777, failed to deliver a decisive victory despite tactical successes in numerous engagements. George Washington, commanding the Continental Army, recognized his forces' limitations. He adopted a Fabian strategy, avoiding decisive battles while keeping his army intact, gradually wearing down enemy resolve through persistence rather than dramatic victories. Though defeated at Long Island, Brandywine, and Germantown, his forces achieved crucial successes at Trenton and Princeton that boosted flagging morale and demonstrated the rebellion's resilience. The American commander succeeded simply by not losing, by maintaining a functional fighting force despite repeated setbacks. The 1777 campaign marked a crucial turning point. General John Burgoyne led an ambitious expedition from Canada southward, intending to isolate New England from other rebellious territories. His force of regular troops, German mercenaries, loyalists, and indigenous allies initially captured Fort Ticonderoga, but soon encountered mounting difficulties. Slowed by difficult terrain and harassed by militia, Burgoyne's increasingly isolated army found itself surrounded at Saratoga. His surrender of nearly 6,000 troops in October delivered not just a military victory, but a diplomatic breakthrough, convincing France to formally ally with the rebellious Americans. France's entry transformed the conflict from a domestic rebellion into an international war. The world's second naval power now challenged Crown forces across multiple theaters, while providing Washington's army with essential military supplies, professional officers, and eventually direct military support. Spain subsequently joined as a French ally, forcing London to defend distant territories from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean. This expanded conflict diluted military resources and complicated strategic planning as policymakers balanced European priorities against American operations. Financial factors increasingly influenced the war's course. While Parliament could borrow enormous sums, the conflict's cost strained even the sophisticated London financial markets. American forces faced even greater fiscal challenges. The Continental Congress lacked taxation power and relied on printing increasingly worthless paper currency. Not worth a continental became a byword for something valueless as hyperinflation ravaged the American economy. The French alliance provided crucial financial support, though at the cost of massive debt that would later contribute to France's own revolution. The Southern theatre gained prominence in the conflict's later stages. After the Franco-American alliance, strategists in London shifted focus toward the Carolinas and Virginia, where loyalist sentiment seemed stronger. Despite victories at Savannah and Charleston, these operations failed to restore Crown authority durably. Local militia forces, under leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, employed guerrilla tactics against conventional troops, while Nathaniel Greene's Continental Army units used mobility and local knowledge to strategic advantage. The conflict's global dimensions expanded when the Dutch Republic entered as an American ally, and Catherine the Great of Russia organized neutral nations into the League of Armed Neutrality, challenging the Royal Navy's maritime practices. Meanwhile, the Anglo-French rivalry spread to India, where the East India Company and French forces renewed their struggle for influence among local powers. The Caribbean saw intensive naval combat as both sides sought to capture or defend valuable sugar islands. This worldwide confrontation stretched military resources thin, forcing difficult strategic choices between theaters. On North American battlefields, the war took on characteristics that distinguished it from European conflicts. While set-piece battles occurred periodically, much fighting involved small unit actions, ambushes, raids, and skirmishes. Militia forces on both sides employed intimate knowledge of local terrain. Indigenous nations aligned strategically with either side based on calculations of their own interests. The conflict often blurred distinctions between combatants and civilians, with communities dividing between loyalist and revolutionary sympathies, sometimes resulting in brutal neighbor-against-neighbor violence. These internal divisions revealed how the conflict simultaneously constituted both a revolution and a civil war. Approximately one-fifth of the population remained loyal to the crown, while another substantial portion attempted to remain neutral. Some 19,000 Americans served in loyalist military units, while perhaps 100,000 loyalist refugees eventually evacuated to Canada, the Caribbean, or back across the Atlantic. These internal fractures created enduring bitterness, with victorious revolutionaries confiscating loyalist property and sometimes perpetrating violent reprisals against their countrymen. The war's decisive campaign came at Yorktown in 1781. After years of inconclusive engagements, a rare convergence of favorable circumstances presented Washington with a unique opportunity. The French West Indies fleet, under Admiral de Grasse, temporarily achieved naval superiority along the Virginia coast, while the Comte de Rochambeau's French army joined continental forces in a rapid southward march. Lord Cornwallis, commanding Crown forces in Virginia, found himself trapped on the Yorktown Peninsula without naval support. His surrender on October 19th effectively ended major combat operations, though formal peace remained distant. Peace negotiations began in Paris, with American diplomats John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay securing remarkably favorable terms despite their nation's precarious position. The agreement recognized American independence, established generous boundaries extending to the Mississippi River, and granted fishing rights off Newfoundland. Most significantly, the negotiators extracted themselves from their French alliance obligations by concluding a separate peace. The Treaty of Paris, signed in September 1783, formally ended the conflict, though frontier violence continued in areas where indigenous nations rejected the peace terms. For the departing European power, the American defeat necessitated profound strategic recalibration. The loss of 13 mainland territories removed approximately half the North American population from Crown control. Traditional mercantilist assumptions about colonial relationships required rethinking. Trade patterns disrupted by 8 years of conflict needed rebuilding on new foundations. The fiscal burden of war debts demanded administrative reforms and tax increases. Most fundamentally, confidence in the existing model of oceanic governance suffered a severe blow, prompting soul-searching about how to maintain control over remaining overseas possessions. Yet the outcome, while unquestionably a setback, produced more nuanced consequences than catastrophe. Trade with the newly independent United States actually increased in the years following independence as commercial relationships resumed without mercantilist restrictions. Crown forces retained Canada, the Caribbean Sugar Islands, and strategic positions around Hudson Bay and Newfoundland. The Royal Navy maintained its maritime supremacy despite French and Spanish challenges. Most significantly, the East India Company continued expanding its jurisdiction in South Asia, laying foundations for future wealth and influence that would eventually dwarf what had been lost in North America. American independence accelerated the transformation from a primarily Atlantic-focused enterprise to a more globally distributed network. The East India Company, already governing millions in Bengal, gained enhanced parliamentary attention as the most valuable remaining overseas asset. The loss of American timber supplies prompted interest in the forestry resources of New Zealand and Australia. Caribbean sugar possessions received renewed strategic priority, with naval stations strengthened against French and Spanish threats. These reorientations, while partially reactive, demonstrated the adaptability that characterized the broader project of overseas governance. The ideological impact reverberated far beyond immediate strategic concerns. The Republican experiment launched in the former American territories challenged fundamental assumptions about monarchy, aristocracy, and political legitimacy. The language of natural rights, articulated in the Declaration of Independence, offered a revolutionary vocabulary that would inspire subsequent liberation movements worldwide. The American example demonstrated that peripheral territories could successfully assert independence against a European center, establishing a precedent that other subjugated peoples would eventually invoke. This ideological challenge prompted constitutional innovation within the remaining North American territories. The Quebec Act had already established a precedent for accommodating non-Protestant, non-English-speaking populations. After the arrival of thousands of Loyalist refugees, the Constitutional Act of 1791 divided the province of Quebec into Upper Canada, predominantly English-speaking, and Lower Canada, primarily French-speaking, each with representative institutions. These reforms aim to provide local self-government while maintaining ultimate metropolitan authority, an attempt to address the grievances that had fueled American discontent while preserving central control. The American Revolution revealed tensions in Enlightenment political thought that would resurface throughout subsequent anti-colonial movements. American revolutionaries effectively employed the language of liberty to justify independence while maintaining slavery and continuing to dispossess indigenous peoples. This contradiction between liberatory rhetoric and continued practices of exclusion and subjugation characterized many later independence movements. The revolutionary principle that government required the consent of the governed posed fundamental challenges to the entire concept of ruling distant territories without meaningful representation. For those who remained enslaved in the new republic, the revolution delivered mixed consequences. Northern states gradually implemented emancipation, while southern plantations intensified their dependence on forced labor. Many enslaved people had sought freedom by joining crown forces, which promised liberation in exchange for military service. Approximately 20,000 escaped behind royal lines during the conflict, with some evacuating to Nova Scotia, the Caribbean, or Sierra Leone when crown forces withdrew. This pattern of imperial revolutionary conflicts creating opportunities for enslaved people to seek freedom through strategic alignment would recur during subsequent liberation struggles. Indigenous nations confronted changed circumstances after independence. The Treaty of Paris ignored their sovereignty, ceding their territories to the new republic without consultation. Crown officials in Canada maintained alliances with northern nations, creating a buffer against American expansion while securing military partners for potential future conflicts. Southern nations faced unrestrained pressure from American settlers crossing the Appalachians. The mixed outcomes for indigenous peoples highlighted how European imperial rivalries sometimes created space for native autonomy that disappeared when those rivalries resolved. The Loyalist diaspora transformed numerous communities throughout the remaining North American territories. Approximately 30,000 refugees settled in Canada, including free Black Loyalists who established communities in Nova Scotia. Others relocated to the Bahamas, transforming the island's demographics and economy. Some returned to the British Isles, while particularly elite Loyalists received compensation for lost American properties. This scattered exile community maintained transatlantic connections and often contributed to the governance and development of the regions where they resettled. In the Caribbean, the American conflict severely disrupted established trade patterns. Islands previously dependent on North American timber, fish, and grain faced supply challenges when wartime conditions interrupted these connections. After independence, the new United States lost preferential access to West Indian markets under the Navigation Acts. These disruptions accelerated interest in developing alternative supply sources within remaining possessions, particularly Canada, while also encouraging Caribbean planters to reserve more land for food production, despite its opportunity cost compared to sugar cultivation. The intellectual reaction against revolution influenced administrative approaches for decades. Edmund Burke, while sympathetic to American grievances, recoiled from the radical implications of French revolutionary thought. His advocacy for gradual, organic political development, rather than abstract rights-based reforms, influenced a generation of administrators. The cautionary example of revolution prompted greater attention to addressing grievances before they generated independence movements, though not necessarily greater willingness to devolve meaningful power to local populations. The post-revolution era saw administrative reforms aimed at more effective centralized control. The India Act of 1784 established a board of control overseeing the East India Company, asserting parliamentary authority over what had previously operated as virtually a private government. William Pitt's government created new administrative structures that sought to balance commercial interests with strategic and humanitarian concerns. These reforms reflected a recognition that effective overseas governance required more systematic metropolitan oversight, yet still operated primarily through privileged corporations rather than direct state control. Naval lessons from the conflict shaped subsequent maritime strategy. The French fleet's crucial role at Yorktown demonstrated the vulnerability of overseas operations without naval superiority. In response, the Admiralty accelerated shipbuilding programs and developed more extensive networks of naval bases to support global operations. The successful Franco-Spanish siege of Gibraltar, though ultimately lifted, highlighted the importance of overseas strongpoints. These experiences inform planning for the coming conflicts with revolutionary and Napoleonic France, with greater emphasis on maintaining unchallenged naval supremacy regardless of cost. For the newly independent United States, victory brought its own challenges. The weak central government, established under the Articles of Confederation, struggled with the war's financial legacy and interstate rivalries. The 1787 Constitutional Convention created a more robust federal structure, though debates about centralization versus state authority continued. Diplomatically, the new nation navigated challenges including continued crown occupation of northwestern forts, restricted access to Caribbean markets, and complex relationships with European powers. Despite formal independence, the American Republic remained economically and culturally intertwined with its former ruler. By 1783, both nations embarked on new trajectories. The former colonies began their republican experiment, expanding westward into indigenous territories, while debating the tensions between liberty and slavery that would eventually lead to civil war. The United Kingdom, though diminished in North America, accelerated administrative reforms that would enable unprecedented global expansion in the coming century. Their separation, though rooted in bitter conflict, established patterns of cultural, linguistic, legal, and commercial connection that would eventually evolve into what later observers termed a special relationship, one that would profoundly shape world history long after memories of revolution faded. In the aftermath of American independence, attention increasingly turned eastward. While the loss of 13 rebellious territories marked a setback in the Atlantic world, the East India Company was simultaneously transforming from a trading enterprise into a governing power across the Indian subcontinent. This remarkable shift, commercial agents becoming territorial rulers, occurred through a combination of opportunity, necessity, and ambition, rather than through any coherent metropolitan design. The company's territorial control began with Robert Clive's victory at Plassey in 1757, which secured the wealthy province of Bengal. Initially, company agents maintained the fiction of ruling on behalf of the Mughal emperor, collecting revenue through the Diwani tax collection rights, while local nawabs handled administration. This arrangement allowed enormous private profiteering by company officials who exploited their position to amass personal fortunes. Tales of these nabobs returning home with spectacular wealth both fascinated and scandalized the London public. Warren Hastings, appointed as the first Governor-General of Bengal in 1772, attempted to systematize this haphazard governance. His administration established revenue collection systems, judicial structures, and diplomatic relations with neighboring Indian states. Hastings demonstrated genuine interest in Indian cultures and knowledge, supporting translations of Sanskrit texts and establishing the Asiatic Society of Bengal. Yet his tenure remained controversial, culminating in a lengthy impeachment trial in Parliament, though he was ultimately acquitted. The India Act of 1784 marked a pivotal shift in governance. Responding to criticisms of company misrule, Parliament established a board of control with authority over the company's political functions while leaving commercial operations relatively independent. This created a hybrid system, neither fully private nor entirely governmental, that would characterize administration of the subcontinent for decades. The Act represented an early recognition that commercial priorities alone could not guide governance of millions. Lord Cornwallis, appointed Governor-General in 1786 after his surrender at Yorktown, implemented significant administrative reforms. His permanent settlement of 1793 fixed land revenue rates in Bengal, creating a class of zamindars, landlords, with hereditary rights. This decision, intended to establish stable revenue streams, transformed rural social structures and property relationships for generations. Cornwallis also formalized the separation between European officials and Indian subjects, excluding the latter from senior positions in an increasingly racialized administration. Military expansion accelerated under the governorship of Richard Wellesley from 1798 to 1805. His subsidiary alliance system forced Indian states to accept company troops, pay for their maintenance, and surrender foreign policy control while nominally maintaining internal autonomy. These arrangements extended influence without direct rule, creating a constellation of princely states orbiting around company territories. Hyderabad, Mysore, Awadh, and other significant states entered these unequal relationships, acknowledging company paramountcy while retaining symbolic independence. The defeat of Tipu Sultan at Seringapatam in 1799 eliminated a significant obstacle to expansion. As ruler of Mysore, Tipu had allied with France and employed European military innovations within an Indian context. His death during the final battle removed one of few Indian rulers who effectively challenged company dominance. The victory displayed the growing military advantage of company forces, which combined European techniques with Indian troops, sepoys, in a hybrid fighting force that proved remarkably effective throughout the subcontinent. Territorial holdings expanded dramatically through both conquest and annexation. The Marathas, a confederacy of warrior states that dominated central India, presented the final major indigenous resistance. A series of Anglo-Maratha wars culminated in their defeat by 1818, removing the last significant military challenger on the subcontinent. Governor-General Dalhousie later implemented a controversial doctrine of lapse, annexing princely states when rulers died without natural heirs. This policy, viewed as illegitimate by many Indians, brought territories like Satara, Jhansi, and eventually Awadh under direct company rule. Beyond the subcontinent, the company extended its reach across Asia. Singapore's founding in 1819 by Stamford Raffles created a strategic foothold in Southeast Asia. The First Anglo-Burmese War annexed coastal territories that later formed part of Burma, Myanmar. The First Opium War with China secured Hong Kong and forced Beijing to open treaty ports to foreign commerce. These expansions reflected both strategic considerations and commercial ambitions, extending influence across Asia and securing trade routes from the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. The commercial foundations of this expansion lay primarily in agricultural commodities. Cotton from Gujarat and the Deccan, indigo from Bengal, opium from Bihar, and tea from Assam flowed through company networks to markets worldwide. Simultaneously, textiles manufactured in the industrial centres of northern England increasingly flooded Indian markets, devastating local handloom industries that had previously been world-renowned. This reversal, India transformed from exporter to importer of textiles, exemplified the economic transformation wrought by industrialization and imperial trade patterns. Opium represented a particularly problematic but profitable commodity. Grown under company monopoly in India, it was transported to China to address a persistent trade imbalance caused by European demand for Chinese tea, silks, and porcelain. When Chinese authorities attempted to halt this destructive narcotics trade, the resulting conflict, justified under the rhetoric of free trade, forced China to accept the commerce despite its devastating social consequences. This episode illustrated how commercial interests frequently trumped ethical considerations in the expanding Eastern trade networks. Meanwhile, administrative policies increasingly reflected utilitarian and evangelical influences from metropolitan intellectual currents. The Charter Act of 1813 allowed missionaries to operate freely in company territories, ending earlier restrictions based on fears of religious provocation. Educational initiatives emphasized English language instruction, with Thomas Babington Macaulay famously aiming to create a class of persons Indian in blood and colour, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. These cultural interventions reflected growing confidence in the superiority of European models and diminishing respect for indigenous traditions. Infrastructure development accelerated to facilitate administration and commerce. Grand Trunk Road was expanded and improved for military movement and commercial traffic. Irrigation canals increased agricultural productivity while transforming traditional water management systems. Experiments with steam navigation on major rivers enhanced mobility and communication. The last years of company rule saw initial railway construction, beginning a transportation revolution that would eventually create the fourth largest rail network worldwide. These projects served strategic and commercial purposes while generating contracts for metropolitan firms. Urbanization accompanied administrative expansion, with presidency towns of Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras developing as centers of European settlement and commercial activity. These cities displayed stark social divisions, with European sections featuring neoclassical architecture, planned streets, and exclusive social spaces, while adjacent Indian neighborhoods maintained different spatial organizations and cultural practices. Urban institutions like universities, museums, and botanical gardens served both practical administrative purposes and symbolic demonstrations of European knowledge systems. Scientific endeavors flourished amid this administrative expansion. The Great Trigonometrical Survey mapped the subcontinent with unprecedented precision, facilitating both military operations and revenue collection. Botanical investigations catalogued plant species with attention to their commercial and medicinal potential. William Jones and other Orientalist scholars documented languages, literature, and history, though often interpreting findings through European frameworks that distorted indigenous knowledge systems. These scientific projects simultaneously advanced knowledge and served imperial interests. The company workforce evolved significantly over this period. Early administrations featured numerous mixed-race families and cultural hybridity, with many officials adopting Indian customs, languages, and sometimes religions. However, racial attitudes hardened over time, particularly after 1800. Increasing numbers of European women arrived, reducing intermarriage. Housing segregation became more pronounced. The evangelical movement encouraged cultural distance rather than accommodation. By mid-century, the administration displayed more rigid racial hierarchies and less cultural integration than earlier company operations. Alternative centers of power developed alongside company expansion. Calcutta emerged as the administrative capital, with Government House symbolizing authority. 4,000 miles away, Leadenhall Street in London housed East India House, where the company's Court of Directors made policy. Parliamentary oversight from Westminster added another layer of authority. This dispersed governance, with power centers spanning continents, created communication challenges and accountability problems that contributed to administrative dysfunction and opportunities for abuse. The legal system exemplified this hybrid governance. Company courts administered different rules for different populations. English common law for Europeans, while Hindu and Muslim personal laws governed family matters for their respective communities. Criminal procedures increasingly followed European models, but maintained distinctions based on religious and ethnic identity. This plural legal structure acknowledged cultural differences while establishing overarching authority, creating a distinctive administrative approach, later replicated in other colonial contexts. Resistance to company authority took multiple forms. Dispossessed rulers occasionally mounted military challenges, though with diminishing success over time. Religious leaders sometimes organized opposition, as in the Vellore Mutiny of 1806. Peasant uprisings responded to excessive taxation or agricultural disruption. Urban protests contested specific policies. These varied resistance movements, though typically localized and uncoordinated, demonstrated that company rule never achieved uncontested acceptance despite its military advantages. The company simultaneously expanded into new regions beyond the subcontinent. Australia, claimed by Captain James Cook in 1770, received its first convict fleet in 1788, establishing a penal colony at Sydney Cove that gradually developed into a settlement society. New Zealand's colonisation proceeded more slowly, with the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, establishing formal relations with Maori tribes. These Pacific territories, initially administered with minimal investment, would later become significant population centres for European settlement, with very different trajectories from the densely populated Asian possessions. The abolition movement heightened humanitarian scrutiny of company operations. After decades of campaigning by religious groups and reformers, Parliament abolished the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself throughout the realm in 1833. These moral victories emboldened reformers to address other perceived abuses in overseas territories. The company increasingly faced criticism from humanitarian advocates, evangelical Christians, and utilitarian reformers, concerned about the treatment of indigenous populations. This metropolitan scrutiny influenced administrative approaches and sometimes constrained the company's autonomy. Intellectual justifications for rule evolved during this period. Early pragmatic explanations based on commercial advantage gave way to more elaborate civilizational narratives as Victorian sensibilities emerged. The civilizing mission concept gained prominence, framing governance as beneficial guidance for supposedly less developed societies. James Mill's influential History of British India, despite the author never visiting the subcontinent, characterized Indian civilization as stagnant and backward, requiring European intervention for progress. These narratives conveniently aligned moral purpose with commercial advantage. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 to 1858 marked the end of company rule. Beginning with sepoy resistance to cartridges greased with animal fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim religious practices, the uprising spread rapidly through north-central India. Rebels temporarily restored the elderly Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar as nominal sovereign. The rebellion featured exceptional violence on both sides, with massacres of European civilians at Kanpur, followed by brutal reprisals. The uprising's suppression involved widespread destruction and collective punishment that left lasting scars on community relations. The rebellion's causes extended far beyond the immediate cartridge controversy. Annexation policies had generated widespread insecurity among traditional elites. Religious communities feared cultural interference from evangelical influences. Peasants suffered under heavy taxation. Displaced rulers and soldiers harbored resentments. Urban populations experienced economic disruption. These varied grievances coalesced into a significant challenge to company authority, though the rebellion remained geographically limited and never spread throughout the entire subcontinent. Parliament responded by transferring India directly to Crown control through the Government of India Act of 1858. The company, after more than 250 years of existence, was abolished. Queen Victoria became Empress of India, governing through a Secretary of State and Viceroy. This transition marked a formal acknowledgement that governing millions required direct governmental oversight rather than corporate management. The proclamation accompanying this transition promised non-interference in religious matters and respect for princely rights, attempting to address key grievances that had fueled the rebellion. By 1858, the nature of overseas governance had fundamentally transformed from its commercial origins. What began as trading posts operated by merchant adventurers had become an elaborate administrative apparatus governing millions across multiple continents. This evolution, from trade to sovereignty, occurred through innumerable individual decisions rather than any grand design. The East India Company's remarkable history exemplified how commercial ventures unexpectedly generated governing responsibilities, creating new forms of cross-cultural interaction, economic transformation, and political subjugation that would characterize the Victorian era ahead. The decades following the Indian Rebellion witnessed unprecedented global expansion. Queen Victoria's proclamation as Empress of India in 1877 symbolized a new imperial confidence after earlier crises. By the time the monarch celebrated her Diamond Jubilee in 1897, the realm under her sovereignty encompassed nearly 1/4 of the world's land surface and population. This Victorian era marked both the territorial apex and the cultural flourishing of a global project that stretched from the Canadian Arctic to New Zealand, from Caribbean islands to African savannas. from Mediterranean fortresses to Pacific atolls. New technologies dramatically enhanced the capacity for global control. Steamships reduced journey times and increased reliability compared to sailing vessels. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, shortened the route to Asia by thousands of miles. Railways penetrated continental interiors, previously accessible only by arduous overland journeys. Telegraph cables, including Brunel's remarkable transatlantic line, enabled near-instantaneous communication across vast distances. These innovations compressed space and time, making it possible to administer far-flung territories with unprecedented coordination and responsiveness. India transformed under direct crown rule. The new Raj maintained many company administrative structures, but expanded central authority and European oversight. Viceroys like Lord Curzon implemented ambitious programs of public works, educational reform, and administrative reorganization. Railway construction accelerated dramatically, eventually creating a network of over 40,000 miles that unified the subcontinent economically, while facilitating military deployment and famine relief. The Indian civil service, selected through rigorous competitive examinations, developed into a prestigious administrative elite that prided itself on incorruptibility and efficiency. The scramble for Africa represented the most dramatic territorial expansion of this era. Before 1880, permanent European presence in Africa remained limited primarily to coastal enclaves and the Cape Colony. Within 2 decades, European powers had divided nearly the entire continent among themselves. The 1884 to 1885 Berlin Conference established rules for this partition, requiring effective occupation, rather than mere coastal claims to justify territorial control. This diplomatic framework accelerated the military conquest of African societies, regardless of their existing political structures or boundaries. Cecil Rhodes exemplified the ambitious individuals who drove African expansion. Arriving in South Africa at age 17, Rhodes amassed enormous wealth through diamond mining before entering politics. As Prime Minister of Cape Colony, he extended authority northward, with the territory eventually bearing his name as Rhodesia. His vision of a Cape to Cairo corridor of continuous red on the map represented the grandiose territorial ambitions characteristic of this era. Rhodes combined commercial opportunism, strategic thinking, and racial ideologies into a potent justification for expansion that won metropolitan support despite considerable costs. Local populations across Africa resisted incorporation through various strategies. The Ashanti, Zulu, and other kingdoms mounted significant military challenges before succumbing to superior firepower. The Mahdist movement in Sudan combined religious revival with armed resistance, defeating Egyptian forces before falling to Kitchener's campaign. Ethiopia uniquely maintained independence by defeating Italian forces at Adwa in 1896. Elsewhere, communities employed passive resistance, strategic accommodation, or flight to remote regions to preserve autonomy. These varied responses demonstrated that African societies were never passive recipients of external control. Military technology increasingly tilted power balances away from indigenous forces. The Maxim gun, an early machine gun capable of firing 600 rounds per minute, provided devastating firepower against conventionally armed opponents. Artillery, rifles, and other European weapons widened military disparities. Royal Navy gunboats extended power along major rivers, bombarding riverside communities into submission. These technological advantages, rather than inherent organizational superiority, frequently determined conflict outcomes, allowing relatively small European forces to defeat numerically superior opponents. Administrative systems varied considerably across African territories. In West Africa, indirect rule worked through existing chiefs and traditional authorities. In settler regions, like Kenya and Rhodesia, European minorities claimed prime agricultural lands while relegating indigenous populations to reserves. In South Africa, mineral wealth motivated increasingly formal racial segregation to control labor. These diverse approaches shared a common structure of ultimate European authority, exercised through various combinations of local collaboration, segregation, economic pressure, and periodic force. Colonial economies restructured African production around exported raw materials and imported manufactured goods. Gold and diamonds from South Africa, cotton from Egypt and Uganda, coffee from Kenya, rubber from tropical regions, and palm oil from West Africa flowed toward European markets and industries. Transportation infrastructure, railways, ports, telegraphs, developed primarily to facilitate this extraction rather than internal development. These economic patterns created dependencies that would persist long after political independence, establishing structural inequalities with lasting consequences. Economic transformation extended beyond formal territories through informal empire. Regions where financial and commercial influence secured metropolitan interests without direct administration. Argentina, though politically independent, relied heavily on London finance and trade relationships. Ottoman territories witnessed European financial advisors controlling revenue systems to service debts. China granted concessions and treaty ports under duress. These arrangements demonstrated how economic leverage often proved more cost-effective than formal annexation, while still securing key commercial and strategic interests. The Suez Canal represented both strategic and symbolic importance in this system. Opened in 1869 under French engineering leadership, financial difficulties soon allowed London to acquire controlling interest when Prime Minister Disraeli purchased the Egyptian Khedive's shares. The canal shortened the route to India by approximately 4,000 miles, dramatically reducing journey times and shipping costs. Its strategic significance motivated the occupation of Egypt in 1882, ostensibly temporary but lasting until 1956. This vital waterway became the central artery of global commerce and naval mobility. Competition with other European powers intensified during this period. France recovered from earlier defeats to establish a significant African empire and maintain footholds in Asia. Germany, unified in 1871, demanded a place in the sun through territories in Africa and the Pacific. Russia continued its expansion in Central Asia, approaching India's northwestern frontier. Belgium's King Leopold claimed the Congo as a personal possession. Italy sought compensation for late national unification through African acquisitions. These rival ambitions created a complex diplomatic environment, requiring constant negotiation and occasional compromise. The Great Game with Russia exemplified these strategic rivalries. Russian expansion into Central Asia triggered anxiety about potential threats to India's northwestern frontier. This perceived vulnerability motivated forward policies, including the disastrous First Afghan War, border adjustments, buffer states, and intelligence operations. Rudyard Kipling's novel, Kim, popularized this shadowy contest of espionage and influence. Though direct military confrontation never materialized, this rivalry shaped regional boundaries, military planning, and diplomatic alignments throughout the period. China presented both opportunity and challenge. The Second Opium War forced further concessions, opening additional treaty ports to European commerce. The unequal treaties system granted extraterritorial rights, preventing Chinese courts from exercising jurisdiction over European nationals. Hong Kong developed as a crown colony and commercial hub. However, the Taiping Rebellion, Boxer Uprising, and other internal crises demonstrated Chinese society's resistance to external pressure. These tensions between commercial penetration and nationalist resistance foreshadowed later decolonization struggles elsewhere. Ideological justifications for expansion evolved during this period. Earlier commercial explanations gave way to more elaborate civilizational, racial, and religious narratives. The civilizing mission concept gained prominence through figures like David Livingstone, who combined missionary work with exploration. Social Darwinist interpretations portrayed control over lesser races as natural and inevitable. Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, captured this perceived obligation to govern supposedly less developed peoples, conveniently aligning moral purpose with strategic and commercial advantage. Science and knowledge production became increasingly intertwined with imperial projects. The Royal Geographical Society sponsored explorations that combined scientific inquiry with strategic intelligence gathering. Botanical gardens collected and classified plants with attention to their commercial potential. Anthropologists documented indigenous cultures while often reinforcing racial hierarchies. Medical researchers studied tropical diseases whose control was essential for European survival in unfamiliar environments. These knowledge systems simultaneously advanced understanding and facilitated administrative control. Cultural engineering represented a significant aspect of governance. Educational systems emphasized European languages, literature, and history, creating Western-oriented elites in colonized societies. Legal systems imposed European concepts of property and contract, transforming traditional relationships to land and community. Christian missionaries challenged indigenous religious practices while establishing schools and hospitals that extended European cultural influence. These interventions, described as benevolent modernization, fundamentally altered social structures and cultural practices in ways that often persisted beyond political independence. Metropolitan popular culture increasingly reflected awareness of overseas possessions. Adventure novels by Rider Haggard, G.A. Henty, and others romanticized frontier experiences and military exploits. Exhibitions displayed artifacts, peoples, and products from distant territories. Geographic knowledge expanded through improved maps and school atlases showing vast pink-colored territories. Consumer goods like tea, rubber, and cotton linked domestic life to far-flung regions. These cultural manifestations naturalized global dominance within public consciousness, making it seem both inevitable and beneficial. Settler societies developed distinctive characteristics during this period. Canada achieved confederation in 1867, followed by Australia in 1901 and New Zealand in 1907. These dominions gained substantial self-government while maintaining monarchical connections and defense coordination. However, their development involved dispossession of indigenous peoples through combinations of warfare, disease, legal mechanisms, and cultural pressure. The contradiction between their democratic self-image and treatment of indigenous populations created tensions that would later require substantial reconciliation efforts. South Africa followed a more complex trajectory. The discovery of diamonds in 1867 and gold in 1886 transformed the region's economy while intensifying competition between Boer republics and British authorities. The resulting Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902, proved unexpectedly costly in both resources and reputation. Controversial concentration camps established for Boer civilians caused thousands of deaths and generated humanitarian criticism at home. The eventual peace led to the Union of South Africa in 1910, which consolidated white minority rule while laying foundations for the later apartheid system. Indigenous populations worldwide experienced this expansion through various combinations of dispossession, adaptation, and resistance. Australian Aboriginal peoples saw their lands claimed under terra nullius, doctrines that denied their prior occupation. New Zealand's Maori fought the colonial government in the land wars before losing substantial territories through legal mechanisms. Canadian First Nations faced restrictive reserve systems and assimilationist policies. These experiences shared common patterns of cultural disruption, resource appropriation, and demographic decline, though with significant regional variations in both policies and Indigenous responses. Women's experiences of empire varied considerably across contexts. European women initially remained rare in many territories, particularly in tropical regions considered unsuitable for family settlement. Their increasing presence often coincided with hardening racial boundaries and declining cultural hybridity. Organizations like the Lady Dufferin Fund established healthcare for Indian women, combining humanitarian aims with cultural intervention. Meanwhile, Indigenous women frequently faced dual burdens of both gender and racial discrimination, though some found new opportunities through mission education or urban employment. Economic networks grew increasingly complex. The City of London functioned as the global financial centre, handling investments, insurance, and banking services worldwide. The pound sterling operated as the primary international currency, backed by gold. Free trade policies opened markets for industrial exports while securing raw material imports. These arrangements generally advantaged metropolitan manufacturing interests while orienting colonial economies toward resource extraction and agricultural production for export, patterns that created enduring structural inequalities in the global economy. Communication networks physically manifested these connections. Telegraph cables eventually encircled the globe, allowing London to communicate with distant territories within hours rather than months. Shipping lines established regular scheduled services connecting major ports. Postal systems integrated far-flung regions into communication networks. News agencies, like Reuters, distributed information filtered through metropolitan perspectives. These physical and informational infrastructures created an integrated system disproportionately serving central interests, while simultaneously providing tools that would later facilitate resistance to that centralization. Military and naval power underpinned this entire system. The Royal Navy maintained a two-power standard, keeping its fleet larger than the next two naval powers combined. Coaling stations and naval bases provided global reach, allowing projection of maritime power worldwide. Professional armies combined metropolitan regiments with locally raised forces. These military capabilities secured trade routes, deterred rival powers, suppressed resistance, and demonstrated dominance. Though their costs increasingly strained financial resources and required careful prioritization as new challenges emerged. By the early 20th century, signs of stress appeared in this global system. The Boer War revealed military deficiencies and generated domestic criticism. Indian nationalists organized the Congress Party to advocate for greater self-government. Economic competitors, particularly Germany and the United States, challenged commercial dominance. New ideas about national self-determination contradicted traditional justifications for external control. These emerging challenges suggested that the Victorian synthesis of territorial expansion, commercial advantage, technological superiority, and civilizational confidence had perhaps reached its zenith as the new century dawned. The Diamond Jubilee of 1897 marked both the celebration of Victorian accomplishment and, in retrospect, the beginning of a long transition. Colonial troops from across the world paraded through London streets, demonstrating unprecedented global reach. Yet voices like Joseph Chamberlain's already called for imperial reorganization to address emerging challenges. The patriotic confidence of Jubilee celebrations contained undertones of anxiety about maintaining position against rising powers and evolving ideologies. This mixture of triumph and concern characterized the late Victorian relationship with a global project that had expanded beyond anything its early architects could have imagined. World War I would soon test the system's resilience. The global conflict that erupted in 1914 drew on resources from throughout the realm, demonstrating both its reach and the strains of maintaining such vast commitments. Colonial troops fought on multiple fronts, from the Western Front to Mesopotamia, from Palestine to East Africa. The war's enormous costs, human suffering, and ideological challenges would transform the international system and accelerate changes already underway within the imperial structure. This great test would reveal both the remarkable strength and the inherent tensions of the world-spanning system that Victorian confidence had constructed. World War I irrevocably transformed the global order. What began as a European conflict quickly expanded into a worldwide struggle, drawing on resources from every continent. When war erupted in August 1914, the call went out across the realm for men, materials, and support. The response proved remarkable in its scale. India contributed over 1.3 million personnel. Canada sent more than 600,000 men. Australia and New Zealand dispatched forces to distant battlefields. African and Caribbean troops served in various capacities. This unprecedented mobilization demonstrated both the system's impressive reach and the deep connections binding diverse territories to the metropolitan center. Colonial troops fought across multiple fronts. The Indian Army served with distinction in France, Mesopotamia, Palestine, and East Africa. Canadian forces earned legendary status at battles like Vimy Ridge. The Australia and New Zealand Army Corps, ANZAC, forged national identities through their sacrifice at Gallipoli. African carriers supported logistical operations in challenging terrain. These contributions proved essential to the eventual Allied victory, though their significance often received insufficient recognition in subsequent historical accounts dominated by European perspectives. The Ottoman Empire's entry into the conflict as a German ally added Middle Eastern dimensions. Arab populations faced difficult choices between Ottoman Islamic authority and potential independence promised by Allied powers. The Arab Revolt, encouraged by T.E. Lawrence and other officers, aimed to undermine Ottoman control while advancing Allied strategic objectives. The 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement secretly divided the region into French and British spheres of influence, a diplomatic arrangement that contradicted simultaneous promises of Arab self-determination and a Jewish national home in Palestine through the Balfour Declaration. India's wartime contributions generated expectations of political reward. The Secretary of State for India announced in 1917 that policy would increasingly aim at the gradual development of self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government. This carefully worded statement, falling short of independence promises, nevertheless acknowledged that the political status quo had become untenable. The Montagu-Chelmsford reforms subsequently introduced limited representative elements while maintaining ultimate metropolitan authority, an incremental approach that satisfied neither moderates nor nationalists. War's end brought territorial expansion through League of Nations mandates rather than outright annexation. Former German colonies in Africa came under South African, French, and British administration. Middle Eastern territories, previously under Ottoman control, were similarly distributed as mandates theoretically preparing for eventual self-government. This arrangement represented a compromise between traditional annexation and emerging principles of self-determination. While mandate territories functioned effectively as additions to existing holdings, their theoretical temporary status reflected changing international norms about legitimate governance. The post-war settlement attempted to balance imperial maintenance with Woodrow Wilson's advocacy for national self-determination. The resulting compromises satisfied few. Egypt received nominal independence in 1922, while maintaining significant foreign control over defense and foreign policy. Iraq gained similar qualified independence under a monarchy amenable to external influence. These arrangements attempted to reconcile traditional strategic interests with growing nationalist sentiment, creating hybrid political structures that proved inherently unstable as they failed to meet rising expectations for genuine autonomy. Economic consequences of the war proved profound. The conflict's enormous costs transformed the United Kingdom from global creditor to debtor, owing substantial sums to the United States. Sterling's position as the world's primary reserve currency weakened. Manufacturing capacity in developing regions expanded when wartime disruptions limited imports, accelerating industrialization in places like India. Commodity prices fluctuated dramatically, destabilizing export-oriented colonial economies. These economic shifts undermined the financial foundations of global preeminence, while strengthening the relative position of the United States as an emerging power. Soldiers returning to their homelands carried transformed expectations. Men who had fought and bled for the empire questioned why they lacked full citizenship rights within it. African American troops who had experienced different racial attitudes in France returned less willing to accept Jim Crow restrictions. Indian veterans who had served as equals on European battlefields rejected subordinate status at home. The shared sacrifices and experiences of war generated new political consciousness that challenged prevailing hierarchies and assumptions about natural superiority that had previously justified external control. The Irish question reached crisis after the war. The 1916 Easter Rising, though initially enjoying limited popular support, gained retrospective legitimacy through the harsh execution of its leaders. The subsequent War of Independence pitted Irish Republican forces against Crown authorities in a brutal guerrilla conflict. The 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty established the Irish Free State as a dominion, while partitioning 6 Ulster counties as Northern Ireland. This compromise satisfied neither Republican purists nor Ulster Unionists, creating enduring tensions that would periodically erupt into violence over subsequent decades. India emerged as the central challenge to continued global influence. Mahatma Gandhi transformed the Indian National Congress from an elite debating society into a mass movement through innovative, non-violent resistance techniques. The 1919 Amritsar massacre, where troops under General Dyer fired on an unarmed crowd, killing hundreds, crystallized opposition and damaged moral authority. Salt marches, civil disobedience campaigns, and economic boycotts demonstrated the increasing difficulty of governing a population increasingly unwilling to cooperate. These developments forced incremental constitutional reforms that never quite matched the pace of rising nationalist expectations. Palestine presented another intractable problem. The Balfour Declaration's support for a national home for the Jewish people contradicted simultaneous promises to Arab populations. Increasing Jewish immigration, particularly after Hitler's rise in Germany, generated Palestinian Arab resistance, The resulting violence required growing military commitments to maintain order. Royal commissions repeatedly attempted to square the circle of competing national aspirations in limited territory. These efforts increasingly demonstrated the contradictions between strategic interests, humanitarian concerns, and local realities in an increasingly unstable region. Egypt followed a distinctive path. Nominal independence granted in 1922 left substantial foreign control over defense, foreign affairs, and Sudan governance. Nationalist leader Saad Zaghloul mobilized popular sentiment against these limitations. The continued military presence, particularly around the Suez Canal, generated persistent tensions. King Farouk's monarchy maintained pro-European orientation while facing growing popular discontent. These arrangements typified the intermediate status of territories, no longer formally administered, but not fully independent, an unstable condition that characterized much of the interwar system. Economic depression in the 1930s intensified pressures throughout the global system. Commodity prices collapsed, devastating export-dependent economies in Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia. Unemployment in industrial regions reduced demand for raw materials. Financial crises undermined London's position as a banking centre. These economic disruptions generated social unrest that manifested in labour disputes, nationalist mobilisation, and challenges to authority. The Ottawa Agreements of 1932 attempted to create an imperial preference trade zone, but this partial economic integration could not fully counteract global economic forces. The interwar decades witnessed growing nationalist consciousness across Asia and Africa. Kwame Nkrumah, Jawaharlal Nehru, Jomo Kenyatta, and many others studied at metropolitan universities, where they absorbed ideas about liberty and self-determination, while forming networks that would later facilitate independence movements. Pan-African conferences connected intellectuals and activists across continental and diasporic communities. Anti-colonial literature circulated despite censorship efforts. These intellectual and social developments created cadres of educated leaders prepared to mobilize populations against continued external control when opportunities arose. Japan's rise as an Asian power challenged fundamental assumptions about race and governance. Its military victory over Russia in 1905 demonstrated that non-European nations could master modern technology and organization. Its rapid industrialization offered an alternative development model. While Japan's own imperial ambitions in Korea, Taiwan, and eventually China replicated many exploitative patterns, its success, nevertheless, undermined narratives of inherent European superiority that had justified existing global arrangements. This challenge to racialized hierarchies reverberated throughout colonized regions. World War II represented both the system's greatest mobilization and the beginning of its dissolution. Again, resources flowed from across the globe toward the conflict. Again, troops from diverse territories fought on multiple fronts. However, Japan's rapid conquest of Malaya, Singapore, and Burma shattered illusions of invulnerability. The fall of Singapore in February 1942, with 80,000 troops surrendering, dealt a particularly devastating blow to prestige in Asia. These defeats demonstrated that the pre-war order could not simply be restored after hostilities concluded. Fundamental recalibration would be necessary. The Atlantic Charter, issued by Churchill and Roosevelt in August 1941, affirmed the right of all peoples to choose their form of government, creating diplomatic complications given existing colonial arrangements. Churchill famously declared he had not become Prime Minister to preside over the empire's dissolution, attempting to exclude overseas territories from the Charter's self-determination provisions. This contradiction between proclaimed war aims and Churchill's determination to maintain the status quo created tensions with American allies, while raising expectations among nationalist movements seeking to hold Allied powers to their stated principles. Indian independence became inevitable during the war. The Quit India movement, launched by Gandhi in 1942, reflected growing impatience with incremental reform. The formation of the Indian National Army from captured Indian troops demonstrated potential military dimensions to the independence struggle. Labour's post-war electoral victory brought leadership more amenable to Indian self-government. Lord Mountbatten's appointment as the last viceroy accelerated timelines for withdrawal, though with tragic consequences, as hasty partition plans contributed to communal violence that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives during the traumatic birth of independent India and Pakistan. Colonial military contributions again proved substantial during the global conflict. West African divisions served with distinction in Burma. Caribbean volunteers joined the Royal Air Force. The Indian Army expanded to over 2.5 million men, the largest volunteer force in history. Canadian industry supplied vital war materials. Australian territory withstood Japanese bombing. These contributions stretched across every theatre of the global conflict, demonstrating the continued ability to mobilize resources from diverse territories, while simultaneously accelerating forces that would transform the post-war international order. Labour shortages in the United Kingdom led to active recruitment in the Caribbean and elsewhere, initiating migration patterns that would transform metropolitan demographics in subsequent decades. The arrival of the Empire Windrush in 1948, carrying 492 Jamaican workers, symbolized the beginning of large-scale Commonwealth immigration. These population movements, motivated initially by economic needs, created multicultural communities that challenged traditional notions of national identity, while establishing diasporic connections that would influence both sending and receiving societies for generations. Strategic thinking increasingly recognized the unsustainability of traditional approaches. Wartime analysis of India's future concluded that maintaining control against nationalist opposition would require military forces larger than available resources could support. Similar calculations applied to other territories, where maintaining authority against popular resistance seemed increasingly costly. The combination of financial limitations, American anti-colonial pressure, and growing nationalist mobilization created conditions where pragmatic policymakers recognized that managed decolonization offered better prospects than futile resistance to inevitable change. Dominion territories demonstrated both the system's adaptability and its limitations during the war years. Australia's government, facing Japanese threats with limited metropolitan assistance available, increasingly oriented its security planning toward the United States. Canada's industrial production forged stronger continental economic integration with its southern neighbour. South Africa's racial policies generated growing international criticism that would eventually lead to its departure from the Commonwealth. These developments illustrated how even the most constitutionally integrated territories increasingly pursued independent courses aligned with their specific regional and domestic interests. The war transformed economic relationships throughout the system. Sterling area currency controls tightened metropolitan access to dollar reserves generated by colonial exports. War production accelerated industrialization in developing regions when traditional imports became unavailable. Military expenditures created infrastructure, ports, airfields, roads that would facilitate post-war economic development. Colonial marketing boards accumulated substantial reserves by paying producers below market prices during wartime scarcity. These economic arrangements, justified as wartime necessities, created both development opportunities and exploitative patterns that would influence post-war economic transitions. Educational expansion during interwar and wartime periods produced growing professional classes in colonized societies. These Western-educated elites, trained to staff administrative and technical positions, increasingly demanded political voice commensurate with their qualifications. Colonial educational systems, designed primarily to produce subordinate functionaries, inadvertently created nationalist leadership cadres familiar with Western political concepts and organizational techniques. This revolution of rising expectations among educated populations who had internalized democratic ideals while experiencing discriminatory practices created powerful momentum for political transformation. The war's aftermath brought recognition that maintaining global preeminence faced insurmountable challenges. Financial exhaustion limited available resources for overseas commitments. The United States and Soviet Union emerged as competing superpowers, operating on a different scale of military and economic capacity. Rising nationalism throughout Asia and Africa gained increasing international legitimacy. These converging pressures forced recognition that the post-war world would require fundamental reconfiguration of relationships with formerly subordinate territories, though considerable disagreement remained about the pace and nature of these inevitable transitions. By 1945, the system that had dominated global affairs for generations stood at a crossroads. Victory in the world's most devastating conflict had been achieved at enormous cost. Territories spanning continents had contributed blood and treasure to the war effort. Yet this shared sacrifice accelerated forces already undermining traditional patterns of authority and deference. The peoples who had fought for democracy against fascism increasingly demanded its benefits for themselves. The post-war world would witness rapid transformations as these tensions resolved through negotiation, accommodation, resistance, and occasionally violence. The decades between the world wars revealed fundamental contradictions in the imperial project. Territories valuable enough to retain required increasing concessions to nationalist sentiment, while areas granted nominal independence remained subject to informal influence through economic leverage and strategic arrangements. The moral authority required for effective governance weakened as metropolitan practices contradicted stated principles of democracy and self-determination. Economic difficulties limited resources available to maintain traditional systems of control. These accumulating tensions, temporarily subordinated to the necessities of global conflict, would erupt with unprecedented force once the war concluded. Victory in 1945 came at enormous cost. 6 years of global conflict had drained financial reserves, damaged infrastructure, and claimed millions of lives. The United Kingdom emerged triumphant yet fundamentally weakened, facing a transformed international landscape dominated by two new superpowers, the United States and Soviet Union. A massive war debt to Washington, exceeding £3 billion, limited economic options. Domestic priorities demanded attention after years of austerity and sacrifice. Colonial populations, having contributed extensively to the war effort, expected political rewards. These converging pressures created conditions for rapid change across territories that had for centuries remained under European control. India's independence in August 1947 marked the decisive turning point. The jewel in the crown, with its population of over 400 million, represented the most significant possession in size, population, and symbolic importance. Its transition to independence, however chaotic and violent, demonstrated that even the most established governance arrangements had become untenable. The hasty partition into predominantly Hindu India and Muslim Pakistan produced catastrophic population transfers, approximately 15 million people displaced and perhaps 1 million dead in communal violence. This traumatic birth of two independent nations revealed both the human costs of imperial withdrawal and the inability of departing authorities to manage long-simmering religious tensions they had alternately exploited and suppressed. Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy, accelerated the withdrawal timeline from an initial plan targeting June 1948 to August 1947, reducing preparation time by 10 crucial months. This compression, while ostensibly intended to preserve unity by giving opposing factions less time to disagree, proved catastrophic. Administrative systems, police forces, and military units divided along religious lines with insufficient planning. Boundary commissions drew borders through communities with little regard for local realities. The human consequences of this precipitous departure cast long shadows over South Asian politics for generations, while establishing precedents for similarly rushed withdrawals elsewhere. Burma followed India into independence in January 1948. Unlike India, where substantial indigenous administrative experience existed, Burma's governance had remained more directly controlled by European officials until the Japanese occupation. Post-war preparations for self-government proved minimal before independence arrived. The assassination of nationalist leader Aung San, months before the transfer of power, removed a unifying figure who might have moderated ethnic tensions. Civil conflict erupted shortly after independence, as minority populations and communist insurgents challenged the central government. These destabilizing patterns, hasty withdrawal, limited preparation, and subsequent internal conflict, would recur across multiple regions. Ceylon, later Sri Lanka, achieved independence in February 1948 under more favorable circumstances. Its transition featured greater administrative continuity and less immediate violence than its neighbours experienced. However, tensions between Sinhalese majority and Tamil minority populations intensified in subsequent years, as linguistic and religious differences became increasingly politicized. The relative stability of Ceylon's immediate post-independence period masked underlying communal divisions that would later erupt into prolonged civil conflict, demonstrating how the legacy of divide and rule policies often manifested decades after formal independence. Palestine presented particularly intractable challenges in the immediate post-war period. Jewish immigration accelerated as Holocaust survivors sought refuge, while Arab residents resisted what they perceived as European-sponsored colonization of their homeland. Unable to reconcile these competing national aspirations and facing armed resistance from both communities, authorities announced withdrawal plans in 1947. The United Nations Partition Plan, accepted by Jewish leadership but rejected by Arab representatives, provided theoretical framework for two states. However, the chaotic British exit in May 1948, amid escalating communal violence, led immediately to war between the newly declared State of Israel and surrounding Arab nations. Changing international norms accelerated decolonization pressures. The United Nations Charter emphasized self-determination principles. American administrations, despite Cold War strategic concerns, generally applied anti-colonial pressure. Soviet propaganda highlighted the contradiction between democratic rhetoric and continued colonial control. These external factors combined with internal nationalist movements to create multi-layered challenges to traditional authority structures. The moral legitimacy required for effective governance eroded, as maintaining control through force alone proved both practically unsustainable and internationally indefensible. The phrase "winds of change" entered political vocabulary after Harold Macmillan's landmark speech to the South African Parliament in February 1960. Speaking to an audience committed to white minority rule, the Prime Minister noted, "The wind of change is blowing through this continent, and whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact." This frank acknowledgement from a conservative leader demonstrated how decolonization had transcended partisan divisions to become recognized as inevitable, even among those who might ideologically prefer maintaining traditional arrangements. Strategic calculations increasingly favored withdrawal. Military resources stretched thin across global commitments, while facing insurgencies in multiple regions proved unsustainable. The Suez Crisis of 1956 demonstrated the limits of independent action when the United States opposed unilateral military intervention. The expense of maintaining overseas garrisons drained resources needed for domestic reconstruction and modernization. These practical considerations encouraged a shift from territorial control toward influence through economic relationships, cultural ties, and military partnerships, an approach requiring less direct resource commitment while preserving core strategic interests. Southeast Asian territories followed varied independence paths. Malaya experienced a communist insurgency beginning in 1948 that targeted plantation industries and challenged government authority. After 12 years of counterinsurgency operations, independence came in 1957 under a carefully structured constitutional arrangement, balancing ethnic Malay, Chinese, and Indian interests. Singapore initially joined the Malaysian Federation in 1963, before separating in 1965 due to political tensions. The insurgency's defeat represented one of few successful counter-revolutionary campaigns of the era, though at considerable cost and requiring significant political concessions. Cold War considerations increasingly influenced decolonization processes. Both superpowers sought influence with newly independent states, offering economic assistance, military support, and diplomatic recognition. This competitive dynamic sometimes benefited nationalist movements by providing external backing and international legitimacy. However, it also frequently distorted internal political development as indigenous concerns became subordinated to superpower strategic calculations. Local leaders learned to leverage Cold War rivalries, extracting concessions by threatening alignment with the opposing bloc, while navigating dangerous waters between competing external interests. African decolonization accelerated dramatically after Ghana, formerly Gold Coast, achieved independence in 1957 under Kwame Nkrumah's leadership. The floodgates opened with 17 African territories, gaining independence in 1960 alone. This rapid transition reflected multiple factors: nationalist mobilization, international pressure, metropolitan recognition of inevitability, and demonstration effects as each successful independence movement inspired others. Within a single decade, European political control that had dominated the continent since the late 19th century largely disappeared, though economic relationships often preserved external influence through less formal mechanisms. Economic relationships evolved rather than disappeared during decolonization. Sterling area arrangements maintained financial connections. Marketing boards continued controlling commodity exports. Metropolitan banks and firms retained significant presence in newly independent economies. Infrastructure developed during colonial periods oriented production toward external markets rather than internal development. These structural patterns persisted beyond formal independence, creating what critics termed neo-colonialism, continued economic dependency despite political sovereignty. These arrangements benefited external interests and local elites, while limiting economic autonomy for new nations. Newly independent states faced immediate governance challenges. Boundaries drawn by European powers rarely reflected ethnic, linguistic, or historical realities. Administrative systems designed for resource extraction required fundamental reorientation toward development priorities. Educational limitations left shortages of trained personnel for essential services. Political institutions transplanted from parliamentary models often proved ill-suited to societies with different historical traditions and social structures. These challenges made the early years of independence particularly difficult, as new nations attempted to overcome colonial legacies while building state capacity amid competing demands and limited resources. The Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya during the 1950s demonstrated both the violence that could accompany resistance to colonial rule and the often brutal response such challenges provoked. What began as predominantly Kikuyu resistance to land alienation and political marginalization escalated into guerrilla warfare, met with mass detention, torture, and population displacement. Official casualty figures acknowledged approximately 11,000 rebels killed, though subsequent scholarship suggests much higher civilian casualties. These events, long minimized in metropolitan historical accounts, received renewed attention when aging survivors successfully sued for recognition of their mistreatment in the early 21st century. The Central African Federation represented a failed attempt to preserve white minority influence through institutional engineering. Created in 1953 by combining Northern Rhodesia, Zambia, Southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and Nyasaland, Malawi, the Federation aimed to balance European economic dominance with gradually increasing African political participation. This arrangement collapsed by 1963 as African nationalism rejected what appeared to be repackaged subordination. Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland gained independence under African majority governments, while Southern Rhodesia's white minority government issued a unilateral declaration of independence in 1965, leading to international isolation and eventual civil war. Cyprus illustrated the complex intersection of Cold War considerations, communal tensions, and strategic interests. The island's Greek majority sought a gnosis union with Greece, while the Turkish minority feared marginalization. A guerrilla campaign by EOKA, National Organization of Cypriot Fighters, targeted both military personnel and civilians. The eventual independence arrangement in 1960 created elaborate constitutional protections for the Turkish minority, while establishing sovereign military bases that preserved strategic interests. This compromise satisfied no one completely and ultimately collapsed into communal violence and de facto partition. Another example of how hastily arranged departures often failed to resolve underlying tensions. Aden and South Arabia followed a particularly chaotic path to independence. Originally valued as a coaling station and later as an oil refining center, Aden faced nationalist and pan-Arab pressures during the 1960s. The National Liberation Front, NLF, and Front for the Liberation of Occupied South Yemen, FLOSE, competed for leadership of the independence movement while targeting both government officials and each other. Authorities announced withdrawal plans for 1968, then accelerated the timeline as security deteriorated. The hasty departure in November 1967 left the NLF in control of what became the People's Republic of South Yemen, the Arab world's only Marxist state until unification with North Yemen in 1990. The Suez Crisis of 1956 symbolized changing power dynamics in the post-war world. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company, the coordinated Israeli-French-British military response initially succeeded tactically but failed strategically. American opposition, Soviet threats, and United Nations condemnation forced withdrawal without achieving the operation's political objectives. This diplomatic defeat demonstrated that traditional unilateral military action had become untenable without superpower approval, marking a decisive shift in the international order, an accelerating recognition that maintaining traditional influence would require new approaches aligned with post-colonial realities. Migration patterns transformed metropolitan demographics during this period. Labor shortages after the war encouraged active recruitment from the Caribbean, South Asia, and elsewhere. The British Nationality Act of 1948 had created Commonwealth citizenship with broadly shared rights, facilitating movement between formerly separate jurisdictions. These population flows created multicultural communities in previously homogeneous metropolitan cities, established diasporic networks that maintained connections across continents, and eventually generated tensions around race, religion, and national identity that would reshape domestic politics in subsequent decades. The Commonwealth evolved as an institutional framework attempting to maintain connections despite political separation. The organization transitioned from the British Commonwealth of Nations to simply the Commonwealth of Nations, reflecting changing power relationships. The London Declaration of 1949 allowed India to remain a member despite becoming a republic, demonstrating institutional flexibility. Republican membership gradually became the norm rather than the exception. The organization emphasized shared values and practical cooperation rather than hierarchical relationships, though the monarch remained head of the Commonwealth, providing symbolic continuity amid fundamental political transformation. Economic considerations increasingly influenced strategic calculations during this period of transition. The sterling area, wartime financial controls made permanent, created a currency bloc that coordinated dollar earnings and maintained London's role as a financial centre. Commonwealth preference trading arrangements provided protected markets for exports. These economic networks preserved influence even as formal political control receded. However, Britain's 1961 application to join the European Economic Community, though initially rejected by French veto, signaled recognition that regional integration offered better economic prospects than the increasingly fragmented Commonwealth trading system. Educational and cultural relationships endured beyond formal political separation. Universities in London, Oxford, and Cambridge continued training elites from former territories. The English language retained its role in administration, commerce, and higher education across much of the former empire. Legal systems based on English common law persisted with varying modifications. BBC broadcasts maintained information flows and cultural influence. These continuities demonstrated how formal decolonization represented not a complete severing of relationships, but rather their reconfiguration into less hierarchical forms, still preserving significant connections. Hong Kong and smaller territories remained under direct administration as decolonization swept larger possessions. Strategic considerations, legal complexities, or limited independence viability preserved these relationships even as the broader imperial network dissolved. Gibraltar's population repeatedly expressed preference for continued association rather than integration with neighboring Spain. Small Caribbean islands initially formed federations intended for eventual independence, but reverted to separate status when larger units proved politically unworkable. These exceptions to the general pattern of withdrawal created governance challenges as metropolitan policies increasingly focused on development rather than indefinite control. By 1965, the political map had transformed dramatically from just 2 decades earlier. The vast majority of Asian and African territories had achieved independence. Remaining possessions represented exceptions rather than the norm. The rapid unraveling of political control that had taken centuries to establish demonstrated both the unsustainability of governing distant populations against their will in the post-war international system and the pragmatic flexibility that characterized adjustments to changing realities. The remarkable speed of this transition, primarily accomplished within 20 years, represented one of history's most significant and rapid redistributions of political authority. The decolonization process revealed both principled adaptation to changing circumstances and pragmatic recognition of limitations. Rather than futile resistance to inevitable change, the approach generally favored negotiated withdrawals that preserved influence through Commonwealth connections, economic relationships, defense agreements, and cultural ties. This realistic accommodation, though often chaotic in implementation and sometimes marred by unnecessary violence, nevertheless represented a more orderly transition than many revolutionary upheavals elsewhere. The legacy of this approach, maintaining connections despite fundamental political reconfiguration, would continue shaping relationships long after formal authority structures dissolved. By the mid-1960s, the political map had transformed dramatically. Most former possessions had achieved independence, with remaining territories representing exceptions rather than the norm. The transition that began with India's independence had cascaded across continents, fundamentally altering global politics. This final phase of decolonization featured 3 distinct processes: the independence of remaining Caribbean territories, the resolution of the Rhodesian crisis, and the prolonged negotiations over Hong Kong's future. These developments unfolded against a backdrop of domestic economic challenges, Cold War pressures, and evolving international norms that increasingly questioned the legitimacy of any remaining colonial relationships. The Caribbean territories followed diverse paths to self-government. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago had achieved independence in 1962, setting precedents for neighboring islands. Barbados followed in 1966, establishing a stable parliamentary democracy that maintained Commonwealth connections while asserting sovereignty. Smaller islands with limited economic resources often hesitated to assume full independence, recognizing the challenges of viability for microstates in an international system dominated by larger powers. The West Indies Federation, intended to create a unified regional state, had collapsed in 1962 due to disagreements over internal power arrangements, complicating subsequent independence trajectories for smaller territories. Constitutional innovations created diverse relationships, reflecting particular circumstances rather than imposing uniform arrangements. Some territories opted for associated state status, maintaining metropolitan defense responsibility while exercising internal self-government. Others remained crown dependencies, with varying degrees of autonomy. These flexible arrangements recognized both the practical challenges of small island governance and local preferences for continued association in some cases. Such adaptations demonstrated how standard decolonization models sometimes required modification to address specific regional conditions and populations' expressed desires. Economic challenges influenced these varied arrangements. Caribbean economies relied heavily on agricultural exports, particularly sugar, that faced declining market prices and European Economic Community tariff preferences that disadvantaged traditional suppliers. Tourism increasingly replaced agriculture as the economic mainstay, creating different dependencies on external markets. Narcotics trafficking and offshore financial services emerged as controversial economic activities in islands seeking alternatives to traditional exports. These economic vulnerabilities made the transition to full independence particularly challenging for smaller islands with limited natural resources and undiversified economies. Migration from the Caribbean to the United Kingdom created significant diasporic communities that maintained connections across the Atlantic. These population movements, initially encouraged to address post-war labor shortages, transformed urban demographics in cities like London, Birmingham, and Manchester. However, the Commonwealth Immigrants Acts of 1962 and 1968, followed by the Immigration Act of 1971, progressively restricted this movement, reflecting domestic political tensions around race, employment, and national identity. These changing immigration policies highlighted contradictions between maintaining Commonwealth connections rhetorically while limiting the practical implications of those relationships. Southern Africa presented distinctive challenges throughout this period. The Central African Federation's dissolution in 1963 led to independence for Zambia and Malawi, while leaving Southern Rhodesia under white minority rule. Prime Minister Ian Smith's unilateral declaration of independence in 1965 created an internationally unrecognized regime committed to preserving European dominance. Economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and armed resistance by African nationalist movements eventually forced negotiations. The Lancaster House Agreement finally produced recognized independence as Zimbabwe in 1980 under majority rule, concluding one of the most protracted and contentious decolonization processes. South Africa followed a separate trajectory. Though functionally independent since the 1931 Statute of Westminster, its apartheid policies generated increasing international condemnation. The 1961 Sharpeville massacre, where police killed 69 peaceful protesters, accelerated South Africa's isolation. The Republic left the Commonwealth that same year, rather than address mounting criticism of its racial policies. This separation highlighted how shared political values increasingly defined Commonwealth membership, rather than historical connections alone. South Africa's eventual transition to non-racial democracy in 1994 under Nelson Mandela's leadership marked a final resolution to the region's complex post-colonial development. Hong Kong presented unique challenges given its unusual status. The new territories, constituting most of the colony's land area, were held under a 99-year lease from China, set to expire in 1997. Attempts to negotiate lease extension proved unsuccessful, as China's leadership, particularly after Mao Zedong's death and Deng Xiaoping's ascension, insisted on restoring sovereignty over all territories taken during the century of humiliation. The 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration established terms for the 1997 handover, creating a one country, two systems framework intended to preserve Hong Kong's economic system and partial autonomy for 50 years while recognizing Chinese sovereignty. The Hong Kong transition highlighted fundamental changes in global power relationships. A rising China could assert its interests more effectively than its 19th century predecessor. Economic integration had made Hong Kong deeply interdependent with neighboring Guangdong province. The Cold War's conclusion removed Western strategic imperatives for maintaining footholds along China's periphery. These converging factors made Hong Kong's return virtually inevitable, despite concerns about democratic development and civil liberties. The carefully choreographed handover ceremony on June 30th, 1997, symbolically concluded an era of territorial control that had begun over 350 years earlier. The Falklands War of 1982 represented a striking exception to the general pattern of negotiated decolonization. Argentina's military junta, facing domestic unrest, invaded the South Atlantic islands in April 1982, calculating that the United Kingdom would not respond militarily to reclaim a distant territory with minimal economic significance. This miscalculation resulted in a 10-week conflict culminating in Argentina's surrender after significant casualties on both sides. The conflict demonstrated that military force remained relevant in specific contexts, despite the broader trend toward negotiated settlements and the general decline of territorial disputes determined through armed conflict. The Falklands conflict revealed complex domestic politics surrounding remaining overseas territories. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's government, initially unpopular due to economic policies, received substantial public support for the military response. The principle of self-determination for islanders, who overwhelmingly wished to maintain their existing status, gained precedence over geographical proximity or historical claims in diplomatic arguments. These dynamics illustrated how democratic values and resident populations expressed preferences increasingly shaped approaches to territorial disputes, rather than purely strategic or economic calculations about the territories themselves. Domestic economic challenges throughout this period influenced overseas policies. The 1973 oil crisis, industrial unrest, inflation, and declining manufacturing sectors limited resources available for external commitments. International Monetary Fund assistance in 1976 came with conditions requiring public spending reductions. Successive governments faced difficult choices between domestic priorities and maintaining international roles and responsibilities. These economic constraints accelerated the transition from territorial control toward more cost-effective forms of influence through trade, investment, educational connections, and cultural ties that required fewer direct resource commitments. The European dimension gained increasing significance during these decades. After French President Charles de Gaulle's vetoes of membership applications in 1963 and 1967, the United Kingdom finally joined the European Economic Community in 1973. This strategic reorientation reflected recognition that regional integration offered better economic prospects than the increasingly fragmented Commonwealth trading system. The subsequent 1975 referendum confirmed public support for this direction, though European integration remained contentious in domestic politics. This European turn marked a significant shift from global toward regional focus, though without completely abandoning wider international connections. Commonwealth evolution continued throughout this period. The organization expanded to include former territories of other European powers, notably Mozambique, formerly Portuguese, and Cameroon, partly former German territory. Leadership increasingly shifted from London to a broader collective governance, while symbolic roles like head of the Commonwealth preserved connections to the monarchy. The substance of the organization focused on practical cooperation, development assistance, educational exchanges, and sporting competitions, rather than the political and economic primacy that had characterized earlier arrangements. Strategic considerations evolved significantly after the 1968 announcement of withdrawal from East of Suez positions. Facing financial constraints, policymakers concluded that maintaining military bases throughout the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia had become unsustainable. Instead, focus shifted toward NATO commitments in Europe and the North Atlantic. Special relationships with the United States and Commonwealth partners, with shared intelligence arrangements, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, preserved global influence without the costs of maintaining forward bases. This strategic realignment reflected both financial necessity and recognition that traditional military presence had become both financially and politically unsustainable. The 1980s witnessed final resolutions for several smaller territories. Vanuatu, formerly New Hebrides, achieved independence in 1980 after a complex transition from joint Anglo-French administration. Belize gained independence in 1981, despite territorial claims from neighboring Guatemala that required security guarantees. Brunei completed its transition to full sovereignty in 1984, maintaining a monarchical system and considerable wealth from petroleum resources. These varied processes demonstrated continuing adaptability to specific local circumstances, rather than imposing standardized solutions across diverse territories. Gibraltar maintained its status despite Spanish pressure for sovereignty transfer. The Mediterranean Peninsula's population repeatedly and overwhelmingly expressed preference for continued association rather than integration with neighboring Spain. The situation illustrated competing principles in decolonization: territorial integrity versus self-determination of peoples. Unlike Hong Kong, where geopolitical realities made transfer inevitable, despite local concerns, Gibraltar's population successfully asserted self-determination claims against geographical and historical arguments for integration with Spain. This exception to general decolonization patterns demonstrated the complexity of resolving territorial legacies, where resident populations resisted arrangements that external actors considered logical or inevitable. Economic relationships evolved significantly during this period. Commonwealth preference systems gave way to broader trading patterns. London's role as a global financial centre increasingly relied on international finance, rather than privileged relationships with former territories. Investment patterns diversified beyond traditional connections, as global capital markets became more integrated. These economic transformations reflected both the declining significance of former imperial economic networks and the broader globalization that created more complex international economic relationships transcending historical political connections. Migration patterns continued transforming societies on both sides of former imperial relationships. The 1972 expulsion of Asians from Uganda created refugee communities requiring integration in the United Kingdom. Commonwealth immigration restrictions tightened further with successive legislation, reflecting domestic political concerns about integration and social services. Meanwhile, educational and professional opportunities drew students and skilled workers from former territories to metropolitan institutions and employers. These population movements created transnational communities with ongoing connections to both origin and destination societies, maintaining human relationships that transcended formal political arrangements. Cultural connections evolved through education, language, sport, and media. Universities continued attracting international students who often assumed leadership positions upon returning home. The English language expanded its global reach through business, technology, and popular culture. Cricket, rugby, and other sports maintained competitive relationships and shared traditions. BBC World Service broadcasts provided information sources across former territories. These cultural dimensions preserved connections and influence that outlasted formal political relationships, creating what some analysts termed soft power that remained significant even as hard power military and administrative control receded. The 1997 Hong Kong handover ceremony symbolically concluded territorial expansion that had begun with early trading posts and settlements in the 17th century. The carefully choreographed event featured Prince Charles and Governor Chris Patten departing as Chinese officials raised their national flag over the territory. This dignified transition, broadcast globally, represented the final act in a centuries-long drama of territorial acquisition and relinquishment. The ceremony's orchestrated precision contrasted with the often messy, violent, and complex historical processes it concluded, providing visual closure to a global enterprise that had reshaped world history. By the late 20th century, physical remnants of this global project had diminished to a collection of small territories, many with populations preferring continued association. The 14 British overseas territories that remained after Hong Kong's return included Caribbean islands, Mediterranean outposts, Atlantic Ocean territories, and scattered possessions elsewhere. Their combined population of approximately 270,000 people represented barely visible remnants of a system that once governed hundreds of millions. These remaining relationships increasingly emphasized responsible governance and self-determination rather than strategic or economic exploitation, reflecting evolved international norms about acceptable territorial arrangements. This twilight period of imperial dissolution occurred amid profound global transformations. Cold War competition gave way to American unipolarity and increasing economic multipolarity. Globalization created complex interdependencies, transcending traditional political relationships. Information technology revolutions compressed distance and accelerated cultural exchanges. Environmental concerns introduced new dimensions to international cooperation. These contextual changes meant that the conclusion of territorial control represented not just the end of a specific political arrangement, but its supersession by fundamentally different organizing principles in global affairs. Networks rather than hierarchies, influence rather than control, cooperation rather than command. The transition from the world's largest territorial empire to a medium-sized European nation with limited overseas territories occurred with remarkable speed by historical standards. The process that began with American independence in the 18th century reached effective conclusion with Hong Kong's return barely 2 centuries later. This relatively compressed time frame for such fundamental global reconfiguration demonstrated both the unsustainability of governing distant populations against their will in the 21st century modern era, and the pragmatic adaptability that characterized responses to changing international norms, economic realities, and political pressures throughout this transitional period. The Hong Kong handover ceremony in 1997 marked the symbolic conclusion of territorial control that had shaped world history for centuries. Yet the legacies of this global project continue reverberating through contemporary politics, economics, culture, and international relations. The formal dissolution of political authority did not erase deeper structural patterns, institutional frameworks, cultural connections, and historical memories that continue influencing societies worldwide. These persistent echoes manifest in diverse ways, sometimes obvious, often subtle, occasionally contradictory. Across former territories and within the United Kingdom itself, creating complex relationships that defy simple categorization as either beneficial or detrimental. The Commonwealth of Nations represents the most visible institutional legacy, evolving from an association of former territories into a voluntary multinational organization, emphasizing shared values rather than historical hierarchies. With 56 member states spanning Africa, Asia, the Americas, Europe, and the Pacific, this diverse body encompasses approximately 2.5 billion people across both developed and developing economies. Its activities range from educational exchanges and development assistance to the quadrennial Commonwealth Games. Though lacking significant enforcement mechanisms, the organization provides dialogue forums, technical cooperation, and symbolic connections that maintain relationships across former imperial boundaries. Contemporary governance systems reflect institutional inheritances across formally administered territories. Parliamentary democratic models, though modified to address local circumstances, operate in numerous independent nations. Legal systems based on common law principles function throughout former possessions, combining procedural frameworks inherited from colonial periods with indigenous legal traditions and post-independence legislative developments. Administrative structures, from civil service organization to educational credentialing, often maintain recognizable forms despite decades of sovereign adaptation. These institutional echoes demonstrate how governance patterns established during colonial periods continue shaping contemporary state operations decades after independence. Economic legacies manifest through persistent structural patterns. Infrastructure developed primarily for resource extraction, railways, ports, roads, continues shaping transportation networks in many former territories. Agricultural production often remains oriented toward export commodities established during colonial periods. Foreign investment patterns frequently follow historical relationships, though with increasing diversification as globalization creates more complex economic connections. These economic inheritances generate contradictory effects, providing necessary infrastructure while simultaneously reinforcing dependency relationships that limit economic sovereignty and development potential in some regions. Language represents perhaps the most widespread cultural legacy. English functions as an official or significant language in over 60 countries worldwide, facilitating global communication while sometimes marginalizing indigenous linguistic traditions. Educational systems frequently maintain English language instruction, particularly at higher levels. Literature, media, and popular culture flow through English language channels that reflect historical connections while creating contemporary cultural exchanges. This linguistic legacy simultaneously enables global connectivity and perpetuates cultural hierarchies established during colonial periods, creating both opportunities and challenges for formerly colonized societies navigating globalized communications environments. Migration patterns established through historical connections continue reshaping contemporary demographics. Approximately 1.2 million United Kingdom residents were born in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, with additional millions descending from earlier migrants. Caribbean, African, and other Commonwealth origin communities have similarly transformed metropolitan demographics. Meanwhile, British emigration to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and elsewhere established English-speaking populations worldwide. These human movements created multicultural societies with ongoing transnational connections that transcend formal political boundaries, maintaining relationships through family ties, cultural practices, religious institutions, and economic exchanges. Educational relationships persist through university attendance, research partnerships, and intellectual exchanges. Thousands of students from former territories continue studying at Oxford, Cambridge, London, and other institutions annually. Academic disciplines like anthropology, Oriental studies, and imperial history emerged through colonial relationships and continue evolving in response to post-colonial criticisms. Educational credentials earned in the United Kingdom often confer prestige in former territories, maintaining soft power influence through knowledge transmission and professional networks. These intellectual connections simultaneously preserve historical relationships and generate new critical perspectives on those very histories. Cultural productions increasingly re-examine imperial legacies through literature, film, art, and academic scholarship. Writers like Salman Rushdie, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and Zadie Smith explore complex identities formed through historical encounters. Historians including Linda Colley, John Darwin, and Priyamvada Gopal offer nuanced interpretations challenging both triumphalist narratives and simplistic condemnations. Museums reconsider their collections and presentation approaches, acknowledging acquisition histories previously obscured. These cultural reconsiderations reflect ongoing processes of reckoning with complex historical legacies that defy reduction to either uncritical celebration or wholesale condemnation. Sporting competitions maintain connections established during earlier periods. Cricket remains passionately followed across South Asia, the Caribbean, and Australasia. Rugby unites and divides nations across traditional Commonwealth lines. The Commonwealth Games bring athletes together from diverse nations in quadrennial competitions. These sporting relationships preserve shared traditions while simultaneously providing arenas where former colonies symbolically challenge former rulers on playing fields rather than battlefields. The intense satisfaction when India defeats England in cricket or New Zealand overcomes the British Lions in rugby reflects how sporting contests provide ritualized expressions of independence and national identity within frameworks of continuing association. Debates over museum collections and cultural artifacts increasingly address colonial acquisition histories. The Parthenon marbles in the British Museum, Benin bronzes scattered across European collections, and countless other cultural treasures obtained during periods of unequal power. Relationships face growing repatriation demands. Museums increasingly acknowledge problematic acquisition contexts while developing various approaches to address these concerns. From digital repatriation and shared stewardship to physical returns in specific cases. These ongoing negotiations reflect broader reconsiderations of historical relationships and attempts to reconcile preservation responsibilities with recognition of past injustices in cultural appropriation. Reparations discussions have emerged in various contexts, including Caribbean nations' claims regarding transatlantic slavery and campaigns by groups like the Mau Mau veterans who successfully sued for compensation regarding detention and torture during Kenya's independence struggle. These movements face significant challenges, including legal frameworks designed to limit historical liability, difficulties quantifying damages across generations, and diplomatic reluctance to establish precedents. Nevertheless, they represent important symbolic and substantive efforts to address historical injustices with contemporary consequences, forcing public reconsideration of relationships often portrayed as belonging exclusively to the past. Environmental legacies manifest through landscape transformations, agricultural patterns, and resource extraction systems established during colonial periods. Plantation monocultures replaced diverse ecosystems across tropical regions. Mining operations altered landscapes while creating persistent pollution. Species introductions disrupted ecological systems. Colonial botanical gardens facilitated plant transfers that transformed agricultural systems worldwide. These environmental modifications continue shaping contemporary landscapes, agricultural practices, and ecological challenges long after the political systems that initiated them dissolved. Contemporary climate justice movements increasingly highlight these historical environmental relationships and their ongoing consequences. Military partnerships maintain security relationships that transcend formal imperial dissolution. The Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangement between the United Kingdom, United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand preserves special relationships among English-speaking nations. Defense cooperation agreements maintain military connections with Singapore, Malaysia, and other former territories. Training partnerships and equipment sales preserve security relationships across former imperial boundaries. These continuing military and intelligence connections demonstrate how strategic relationships established during colonial periods frequently outlast formal political arrangements, adapting to changing geopolitical contexts while maintaining historical partnership patterns. Public memorials and commemorations increasingly acknowledge complicated histories. Statues of figures like Cecil Rhodes and Edward Colston face reconsideration, removal, or contextualizing information addressing their roles in historical oppression. Educational curricula gradually incorporate more complex narratives about imperial history. Public discussions increasingly recognize diverse perspectives on historical events previously presented through narrowly metropolitan viewpoints. These evolving commemorative practices reflect broader societal reconsiderations of historical narratives, attempting to acknowledge multiple perspectives while navigating politically charged debates about national identity and historical responsibility. Legal frameworks continue influencing contemporary international relationships. Treaties signed during colonial periods sometimes remain legally binding on successor states. Maritime boundaries, established through historical arrangements, affect current resource rights. Intelligence sharing agreements maintain security cooperation across former imperial networks. The United Nations and other international organizations incorporate procedural and structural elements derived from imperial precedents. These legal inheritances demonstrate how formal arrangements established during colonial periods continue structuring international relationships long after the political context that created them have fundamentally transformed. Brexit debates revealed continuing tensions around national identity, international relationships, and historical memory. Proponents sometimes invoked nostalgic, imperial imagery of global Britain, reclaiming worldwide influence freed from European constraints. Critics noted the mismatch between such nostalgic visions and contemporary geopolitical realities. Commonwealth relationships received renewed attention as potential alternative partnerships, though with limited concrete developments. These contentious debates demonstrated how imperial memories continue influencing contemporary political discourse, sometimes through implicit assumptions and historical references that shape policy discussions without explicit acknowledgement of their origins. The Windrush scandal highlighted continuing consequences of imperial dissolution and migration patterns. Commonwealth citizens who arrived legally before immigration restrictions, particularly from Caribbean territories, suddenly faced deportation threats due to lacking documentation from decades earlier. This administrative crisis exposed how racial perceptions, immigration anxieties, and bureaucratic failures created vulnerability for citizens with legitimate settlement rights. The subsequent governmental apologies, compensation programs, and policy revisions demonstrated both the continuing relevance of imperial legacies in contemporary governance and the painful human consequences when those historical relationships receive insufficient recognition in policy implementation. Climate change discussions increasingly acknowledge historical responsibility dimensions. Industrialization, fueled by colonial resources, contributed disproportionately to cumulative carbon emissions from developed nations, while affecting vulnerable former colonies through rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and agricultural disruptions. Climate justice advocates emphasize these historical relationships when arguing for differentiated responsibilities in addressing global climate challenges. These perspectives introduce historical dimensions to contemporary environmental negotiations, highlighting how past extraction patterns continue shaping present vulnerabilities and future responsibilities across former imperial boundaries. Contemporary racism and discrimination in many societies connect to ideologies developed during imperial expansion to justify control over diverse populations. Racial hierarchies established during colonial periods continue influencing social structures, economic opportunities, and cultural representations despite formal legal equality. These persistent patterns demonstrate how ideological frameworks outlast the political structures that originally promoted them, becoming embedded in cultural assumptions and institutional practices that prove remarkably resilient despite contradicting contemporary democratic values of equality and human rights. Academic disciplines continue evolving in response to post-colonial critiques. Edward Said's groundbreaking Orientalism challenged knowledge production about formerly colonized societies. Subaltern studies, historians recovered voices marginalized in colonial archives. Post-colonial literary critics identified continuing cultural patterns reflecting historical power relationships. These scholarly interventions transformed academic approaches across disciplines from literature and history to anthropology and international relations, demonstrating how intellectual frameworks established during colonial periods required fundamental reconsideration rather than simply incremental revision. Religious landscapes reflect complex historical encounters. Anglican and other Protestant denominations established during colonial periods maintained significant presence in former territories, sometimes with theological perspectives more conservative than their metropolitan counterparts. Catholicism spread through Portuguese and Spanish imperial networks while adapting to local contexts. Hinduism, Islam, and African traditional religions experienced various accommodations, resistances, and transformations through colonial encounters. These religious evolutions created diverse spiritual landscapes that reflect historical interactions while continuously evolving through contemporary theological developments and interfaith dialogues. Healthcare systems often maintain structural elements established during colonial periods. Hospital systems, medical education, and public health approaches frequently reflect models introduced through imperial administration, though adapted to post-independence circumstances and integrated with indigenous healing traditions. International health organizations like the World Health Organization incorporate procedural and organizational elements derived from colonial medical services. These institutional continuities demonstrate how professional practices established during colonial periods often outlasted the political arrangements that introduced them, creating hybrid systems combining multiple medical traditions and administrative approaches. Legal pluralism characterizes many former territories where customary law, religious legal traditions, colonial legal transplants, and post-independence legislation create complex, overlapping systems. Family law, property rights, and inheritance frequently operate through multiple legal frameworks simultaneously. Courts navigate tensions between universal rights principles and community-specific legal traditions. These plural legal arrangements demonstrate how colonial introductions of European legal concepts created layered systems, rather than simply replacing indigenous legal traditions. generating ongoing negotiations between different normative frameworks within contemporary nation-states. Development economics increasingly recognizes how historical patterns shape contemporary challenges. Dependency theorists highlight how colonial economic structures created persistent disadvantages for former territories. Institutional economists examine how transplanted governance systems interacted with local conditions to produce varied developmental outcomes. Environmental historians trace how resource extraction patterns established during colonial periods continue influencing contemporary ecological and economic constraints. These analytical approaches demonstrate growing recognition that contemporary development challenges cannot be addressed without understanding their historical contexts and structural origins. The overseas territories that remain connected to the United Kingdom have evolved toward partnerships emphasizing self-government in domestic affairs while maintaining constitutional links. The 14 territories, including Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, Gibraltar, and the Falkland Islands, maintain various forms of local autonomy while preserving connections regarding defense, foreign affairs, and ultimate constitutional authority. These arrangements represent neither traditional colonial relationships nor complete independence, but rather negotiated associations, reflecting both practical considerations and democratically expressed local preferences for continued connection rather than sovereign separation. Military legacy issues continue requiring attention decades after formal decolonization. Unexploded ordnance from conflict periods endangers populations across former territories. Nuclear testing sites in Australia and the Pacific created environmental contamination with intergenerational health consequences. Military bases returned in various conditions, sometimes requiring extensive environmental remediation. These physical remnants of military activities demonstrate how actions during colonial periods continue creating safety hazards, environmental challenges, and health concerns, long after the political arrangements that authorized them have dissolved. Contemporary terrorism sometimes connects to historical grievances related to imperial policies. Extremist groups occasionally reference historical events like the Amritsar massacre, Palestine mandate policies, or boundary-drawing decisions when justifying violence. While such historical references typically represent selective and distorted interpretations rather than legitimate grievances, they nevertheless demonstrate how imperial legacies continue providing narrative resources mobilized for contemporary political purposes, requiring careful differentiation between legitimate historical reassessment and exploitation of historical events for violent agendas. As the 21st century progresses, the echoes of empire grow simultaneously more distant and more thoroughly examined. Time creates perspective, while generational distance enables more dispassionate analysis. Historical research increasingly incorporates multiple viewpoints, archival sources, and interdisciplinary approaches. Public discourse gradually acknowledges complexities previously overlooked. Educational curricula slowly expand to include diverse perspectives on shared histories. These evolving understandings demonstrate how imperial legacies remain neither frozen in nostalgic celebration nor confined to simplistic condemnation, but rather continue developing through ongoing processes of historical reconsideration, institutional evolution, and cultural renegotiation. The British Empire's legacies ultimately defy straightforward evaluation as either entirely positive or negative. Infrastructure development facilitated resource extraction while creating transportation networks still used today. Educational systems spread literacy while often disparaging indigenous knowledge. Legal systems established property rights while dispossessing traditional landholders. Medical advances improved public health, while sometimes conducting unethical experiments on subject populations. These contradictory outcomes resist reduction to simple judgments, requiring nuanced appreciation of both destructive consequences and constructive developments that emerged through historical processes, combining exploitation, resistance, adaptation, and exchange across centuries of encounter. The complex legacies of this global system continue shaping our contemporary world in ways both visible and hidden, deliberate and unintended, beneficial and harmful. Languages, legal systems, political institutions, economic relationships, cultural productions, religious practices, and countless other aspects of modern life bear imprints of this historical experience that connected diverse societies across continents. Understanding these continuing influences requires neither uncritical celebration nor wholesale condemnation, but rather careful examination of how past relationships continue shaping present realities and future possibilities across our interconnected world.